The dawn of the 9th century witnessed one of history's most consequential ceremonies when Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon the head of Charles, King of the Franks, in St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Day, 800 CE. This moment marked not merely the elevation of a barbarian king to imperial status, but the conscious revival of an imperial ideal that had lain dormant in Western Europe for over 3 centuries. Charlemagne's coronation represented the crystallization of a political concept that would dominate European affairs for the next 1,000 years. The notion that a Christian emperor could legitimately claim succession to the Roman Caesars while wielding temporal authority over a united Christendom. The circumstances surrounding this coronation reveal the complex interplay of political necessity and religious legitimacy that characterized early medieval governance. Pope Leo III, facing serious accusations of moral impropriety from Roman nobles, desperately needed a powerful protector. Charlemagne, having already conquered the Lombard kingdom and established Frankish hegemony over much of Italy, possessed both the military strength and the pious reputation necessary to serve as the church's champion. Yet the coronation itself allegedly caught Charlemagne by surprise, with contemporary sources suggesting he claimed he would never have entered the basilica had he known the Pope's intentions. This protestation, whether genuine or calculated, highlighted the delicate balance between secular and ecclesiastical authority that would plague imperial politics for centuries. The newly crowned emperor controlled a vast territory stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe River, encompassing modern-day France, Germany, the Low Countries, northern Italy, and portions of Spain and Eastern Europe. This Carolingian empire represented the most successful attempt at political unification in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. Charlemagne's administrative system relied heavily on personal loyalty and direct royal supervision, with the emperor constantly travelling throughout his domains to maintain control. His missi dominici, royal envoys dispatched to oversee local administration, served as the primary mechanism for ensuring compliance with imperial directives across this sprawling realm. The Carolingian Renaissance flourished under Charlemagne's patronage, transforming the intellectual landscape of Western Europe. The emperor's court at Aachen became a magnet for scholars from across the known world, including Alcuin of York, Theodulf of Orleans, and Einhard, who would later pen the definitive biography of his patron. These learned men established scriptoria that preserved classical texts, while developing the clear, standardized script known as Carolingian minuscule. The palace school at Aachen educated not only members of the royal family, but also the sons of nobles from throughout the empire, creating a shared cultural and intellectual foundation that transcended regional boundaries. However, the Carolingian Empire's unity proved ephemeral. The partition of Verdun in 843 divided Charlemagne's inheritance among his 3 grandsons, creating the foundation for the eventual emergence of France and Germany as separate political entities. Louis the German received the eastern portion, which encompassed the Germanic territories beyond the Rhine, while Charles the Bald inherited the western regions that would become France. Lothar I retained the imperial title along with a narrow strip of territory stretching from the North Sea to Italy, including the imperial capitals of Aachen and Rome. The East Frankish kingdom under Louis the German faced immediate challenges that would shape its distinctive character. Unlike the more Romanized western territories, the eastern regions contained numerous Germanic tribes that had only recently been incorporated into the Frankish sphere. The Saxons, Bavarians, Swabians, and Franconians maintained strong tribal identities and local customs that resisted centralized authority. Louis the German's reign required constant military campaigns to suppress rebellions and maintain territorial integrity, while external threats from Vikings, Slavs, and eventually Magyars placed additional strain on royal resources. The gradual dissolution of Carolingian authority in the East Frankish kingdom created opportunities for ambitious nobles to assert greater independence. The concept of feudalism, with its emphasis on personal bonds between lord and vassal, began to replace the more centralised Carolingian administrative system. Local counts and dukes accumulated hereditary rights over their territories, transforming what had been royal appointments into autonomous principalities. This decentralisation of power would become a defining characteristic of German political development, distinguishing it from the more centralised monarchies emerging in France and England. The death of Louis the Child in 911 marked the end of Carolingian rule in the East Frankish kingdom. The German nobles, faced with the choice between accepting West Frankish suzerainty or selecting their own king, chose Conrad I, Duke of Franconia, as their ruler. Conrad's reign proved tumultuous, as he struggled to assert royal authority over the powerful stem duchies while simultaneously defending against Magyar raids that devastated the Eastern territories. His deathbed recommendation that the crown pass to Henry, Duke of Saxony, reflected both political pragmatism and recognition that effective kingship required military prowess above noble birth. Henry I, known as Henry the Fowler, ascended to the German throne in 919 and immediately faced the challenge of unifying a fragmented realm. His Saxon origins provided him with a power base in the militarized frontier regions that had borne the brunt of Magyar attacks. Unlike his predecessors, Henry understood that royal authority must be built upon military success rather than inherited legitimacy. He systematically strengthened the kingdom's defences by constructing fortified towns, reorganising the army, and negotiating temporary truces with external enemies to consolidate internal control. The Magyar threat dominated Henry's strategic calculations throughout his reign. These nomadic warriors from the Pannonian Plain had been conducting devastating raids into Western Europe since the late 9th century, their superior mobility and archery skills making them nearly invincible in open battle. Henry's response involved both defensive and offensive measures. He fortified strategic locations to protect civilian populations while simultaneously preparing for a decisive confrontation that would eliminate the Magyar threat permanently. Otto I inherited his father's throne in 936, with a clear understanding of the challenges facing German kingship. The young monarch's coronation at Aachen deliberately evoked Carolingian precedents, but Otto's conception of royal authority extended far beyond his predecessor's achievements. He envisioned a restored empire that would unite Germany, Italy, and eventually the entire Christian world under Saxon leadership. This imperial ambition required not only military success, but also the careful cultivation of ecclesiastical support and the subordination of the powerful stem duchies to royal authority. The early years of Otto's reign witnessed a series of rebellions that tested his resolve and military capabilities. His younger brother Henry conspired with several dukes to overthrow the king, forcing Otto to demonstrate that Saxon military prowess could overcome numerical disadvantages through superior tactics and leadership. The rebellion's suppression established Otto's reputation as a formidable warrior king while simultaneously eliminating potential rivals to his authority. These internal conflicts, though disruptive, ultimately strengthened royal power by providing justification for the confiscation of rebel territories and their redistribution to loyal supporters. Otto's ecclesiastical policy represented a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. Unlike his predecessors, who had often found themselves in conflict with church hierarchy, Otto cultivated close relationships with bishops and abbots throughout his kingdom. He appointed loyal clerics to important ecclesiastical positions, ensuring that church resources would support rather than undermine royal authority. This policy of Reichskirchen system transformed the German Church into an integral component of royal administration, with bishops serving as both spiritual leaders and royal officials. The Battle of Lechfeld on August 10th, 955, marked the culmination of Otto's military preparations against the Magyar threat. The Hungarian forces led by Bulk-Sue and Lehel had penetrated deep into Bavaria, besieging Augsburg and threatening to devastate the entire region. Otto's response demonstrated both strategic acumen and personal courage as he assembled a multinational army that included not only German forces but also contingents from Bohemia and other Allied territories. The battle itself unfolded on the plains south of Augsburg, where Otto's heavy cavalry proved decisive against the traditionally mobile Magyar forces. The engagement began with the Magyars employing their characteristic feigned retreat tactics, attempting to draw the German forces into a disorganized pursuit. Otto's disciplined response, maintaining formation while gradually advancing, prevented the enemy from exploiting their mobility advantages. The decisive moment came when the German heavy cavalry, led by Otto himself, charged the Magyar centre while simultaneously enveloping their flanks. The Hungarian forces, caught between converging attacks and unable to manoeuvre effectively, suffered catastrophic losses that effectively ended their threat to Western Europe. The victory at Lechfeld transformed Otto from a regional German king into a European hero whose reputation extended throughout Christendom. The defeated Magyar leaders were captured and executed, while the survivors retreated to Hungary, where they gradually abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and adopted sedentary agriculture. This transformation of the Magyars from raiders to settled neighbours eliminated one of the primary external threats to German security, while simultaneously demonstrating Otto's capacity for decisive military leadership. The aftermath of Lechfeld provided Otto with the prestige necessary to pursue his imperial ambitions in Italy. The Italian peninsula, fragmented among competing noble families and threatened by Saracen raids, offered opportunities for intervention that could justify claims to imperial succession. Otto's marriage to Adelaide of Italy in 951 had already established his presence south of the Alps, but the victory over the Magyars provided the military reputation necessary to assert effective control over the fractious Italian nobility. Otto's imperial coronation in St. Peter's Basilica on February 2nd, 962, represented the culmination of his political and military achievements. Pope John XIV, facing threats from Berengar Kun of Italy, had appealed to Otto for protection, offering the imperial crown in exchange for military support. The ceremony itself consciously evoked Charlemagne's coronation, with Otto receiving the same crown and imperial regalia that had adorned his Carolingian predecessor. Yet this restoration of imperial dignity in the West carried different implications than its 8th century predecessor, as Otto's empire rested upon German rather than Frankish foundations. The Ottonian Renaissance that flourished under Otto's patronage differed significantly from its Carolingian predecessor in both scope and character. While Charlemagne's cultural revival had emphasized the preservation and transmission of classical learning, Otto's court focused more heavily on the integration of Christian and imperial ideology. The magnificent illuminated manuscripts produced in Ottonian scriptoria, such as the Codex Aureus of Echternach, combined Byzantine artistic influences with Germanic decorative traditions to create a distinctive imperial style that celebrated both Christian piety and temporal authority. The establishment of the church-state partnership under Otto I created institutional frameworks that would define imperial governance for centuries. The emperor's role as protector of the church carried both privileges and responsibilities that extended far beyond mere political alliance. Otto's intervention in papal elections, his appointment of bishops throughout the empire, and his patronage of monastic reform movements established precedents for imperial authority over ecclesiastical affairs that would generate conflicts throughout the medieval period. The death of Otto III in 1002 without an heir precipitated a succession crisis that would reshape the Holy Roman Empire's political landscape. Henry II, Duke of Bavaria, and great-grandson of Henry the Fowler, emerged as the most viable candidate despite facing significant opposition from other claimants. His coronation at Mainz in 1002 marked the beginning of what would prove to be the final phase of Ottonian rule, though Henry's reign would establish crucial precedents for imperial governance that his successors would build upon. Henry II's approach to imperial administration differed markedly from his predecessors' methods. Where Otto I and Otto II had relied heavily on personal charisma and military prowess to maintain control, Henry developed a more systematic approach to governance that emphasized institutional stability over individual authority. His extensive use of written documentation, standardized administrative procedures, and formal diplomatic protocols created bureaucratic frameworks that would survive political transitions and provide continuity during periods of weak leadership. The emperor's relationship with the church represented perhaps his most significant innovation in imperial governance. Henry II's deep personal piety, which would eventually earn him canonization, translated into unprecedented cooperation between secular and ecclesiastical authorities. He established the bishopric of Bamberg in 1007, creating an ecclesiastical power base in Franconia that would serve as a model for future imperial foundations. The cathedral complex at Bamberg, with its distinctive twin-tower design and elaborate sculptural programs, demonstrated how imperial patronage could create lasting monuments to both religious devotion and political authority. Henry's Italian campaigns revealed both the potential and limitations of imperial intervention south of the Alps. His coronation as King of Italy in 1004 and subsequent imperial coronation in Rome in 1014 followed traditional patterns, but the emperor's actual control over Italian territories remained tenuous. The Byzantine presence in southern Italy, the growing power of maritime republics like Venice and Pisa, and the persistent independence of local noble families created challenges that no amount of military force could permanently resolve. Henry's recognition of these limitations led him to focus more heavily on consolidating imperial authority in Germany rather than pursuing expensive Italian adventures. The transition from Ottonian to Salian rule occurred smoothly in 1024 when Conrad II, great-great-grandson of Otto I through the female line, ascended to the German throne. Conrad's election by the German princes demonstrated the effectiveness of the institutional frameworks established by his predecessors, as the succession process proceeded without the civil wars that had characterized earlier dynastic transitions. The new emperor's Salian origins, derived from his ancestral holdings in Franconia, would give the dynasty its name and establish a new centre of imperial power in the Middle Rhine region. Conrad II's reign marked a decisive shift towards more aggressive imperial expansion and centralization. His conquest of the Kingdom of Burgundy in 1032 to 1034 added vast territories stretching from the Jura Mountains to the Mediterranean coast, significantly expanding the empire's geographical scope and economic resources. The Burgundian acquisition brought wealthy commercial cities like Lyon and Arles under imperial control, while establishing German influence over crucial alpine passes that connected northern and southern Europe. Conrad's administrative integration of Burgundy demonstrated sophisticated understanding of regional differences, as he maintained existing legal traditions and local customs while gradually introducing German administrative practices. The emperor's Italian policy proved equally successful, though it required constant military intervention to maintain imperial authority. Conrad's campaigns against the rebellious Archbishop Aribert of Milan in 1037 to 1038 established important precedents for imperial jurisdiction over ecclesiastical disputes. The Constitutio de Feudis, issued during this conflict, codified feudal relationships throughout the empire and protected the rights of lesser nobles against arbitrary actions by their superiors. This legislation represented the first systematic attempt to regulate feudal obligations on an empire-wide basis, creating legal frameworks that would influence European feudalism for centuries. Henry III inherited a significantly strengthened empire when he succeeded his father in 1039. The young emperor's education had been carefully supervised to prepare him for the complex demands of imperial governance, and his early actions demonstrated both political acumen and military competence. Henry's coronation procession through Germany and Italy in 1046 to 1047 showcased imperial power while allowing him to assess local conditions and establish personal relationships with key nobles and ecclesiastics throughout his domains. The Synod of Sutri in 1046 represented the pinnacle of imperial authority over the Church during the Salian period. Henry III's deposition of 3 rival papal claimants and his appointment of Clement II as Pope demonstrated the emperor's capacity to resolve ecclesiastical disputes through decisive action. The Synod's proceedings, conducted with careful attention to canonical procedures, established precedents for imperial intervention in papal elections while maintaining the appearance of ecclesiastical legitimacy. Henry's subsequent appointments of German bishops to the papal throne created a period of unprecedented cooperation between imperial and papal authorities. The development of the ministerialis system under Henry III transformed the social and political structure of the empire. These unfree knights, bound to imperial service through personal oaths rather than feudal obligations, provided the emperor with a loyal military and administrative class that owed its status entirely to royal favour. Unlike traditional feudal nobles, who inherited their positions and maintained independent power bases, the ministeriales depended completely on imperial patronage for their wealth and status. This innovation allowed Henry to bypass traditional noble hierarchies while creating efficient administrative networks throughout the empire. The ministeriales typically emerged from the ranks of skilled craftsmen, merchants or minor nobles who demonstrated exceptional competence in military or administrative affairs. Their unfree legal status, paradoxically, became a source of strength rather than weakness, as it freed them from competing loyalties to local lords while binding them directly to the emperor. Many ministeriales accumulated substantial wealth through their imperial service, establishing dynasties that would play crucial roles in later imperial history. The castle complexes they constructed, often featuring distinctive architectural elements that proclaimed their imperial connections, became centres of local administration and symbols of royal authority. Henry III's death in 1056 left the empire in the hands of his 6-year-old son, Henry IV, creating a regency crisis that would have profound consequences for imperial authority. The Empress Mother Agnes of Poitou, despite her noble birth and political connections, lacked the military reputation and personal relationships necessary to maintain effective control over the empire's fractious nobility. The Regency period witnessed the gradual erosion of imperial authority as powerful dukes and bishops asserted greater independence from central control. The kidnapping of the young Henry IV by Archbishop Anno of Cologne in 1062 demonstrated the vulnerability of imperial authority during the Regency period. Anno's coup, supported by several German princes, ostensibly aimed to rescue the empire from the Empress Mother's allegedly incompetent governance. However, the Archbishop's subsequent actions revealed more personal ambitions, as he used his control over the emperor to advance his own political agenda and enrich his supporters. The incident established dangerous precedents for noble interference in imperial governance, while undermining the mystique of imperial authority. Henry IV's assumption of personal rule in 1065 coincided with the emergence of reform movements within the Church that would challenge traditional relationships between secular and ecclesiastical authority. The Gregorian Reform, named after Pope Gregory VII, but encompassing broader currents of ecclesiastical renewal, sought to eliminate lay interference in church affairs while asserting papal supremacy over all Christian rulers. These reforms directly threatened the Reichskirchen system that had provided the foundation for imperial governance since Otto I's reign. The immediate cause of the investiture controversy emerged from competing claims over the appointment of bishops and abbots throughout the empire. Henry IV's practice of investing ecclesiastical officials with ring and staff, symbols of their spiritual authority, had been accepted by previous popes as a legitimate expression of imperial patronage. However, Gregory VII's papal bull Dictatus Papae in 1075 explicitly condemned lay investiture as simony, while asserting the Pope's authority to depose emperors who violated church law. This declaration represented a fundamental challenge to the theoretical foundations of imperial authority. The conflict escalated rapidly when Henry IV appointed his own candidate as Archbishop of Milan in direct defiance of papal prohibitions. Gregory VII's response, excommunicating the emperor and releasing his subjects from their oaths of allegiance, created an unprecedented crisis that threatened the very existence of imperial authority. The Pope's actions found support among German nobles, who had long resented Henry's attempts to strengthen central authority at their expense. The combination of ecclesiastical condemnation and noble rebellion created a perfect storm that brought the empire to the brink of collapse. Henry IV's journey to Canossa in January 1077 became one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval history. The emperor's decision to cross the Alps in winter, accompanied by only a small retinue, demonstrated both his desperate circumstances and his political acumen. The 3-day penance outside the walls of Canossa Castle, where Henry stood barefoot in the snow while Gregory VII deliberated his fate, created powerful imagery that would resonate throughout European culture for centuries. The emperor's apparent humiliation, however, achieved its intended political objective by forcing the Pope to grant absolution and thereby undermining the rebellion of German nobles who had justified their actions through Henry's excommunicated status. The reconciliation at Canossa proved temporary, as both emperor and pope continued to pursue incompatible objectives. Henry IV's return to Germany and his subsequent military victories over rebellious nobles restored much of his political position, while Gregory VII's continued support for anti-imperial forces in Germany led to renewed conflict. The emperor's second excommunication in 1080 lacked the dramatic impact of the first, as European opinion had begun to shift against papal interference in secular governance. Henry IV's conquest of Rome in 1084 and his installation of Clement III as pope represented the temporary triumph of imperial authority over papal pretensions. The emperor's imperial coronation by his own appointee restored the traditional relationship between secular and ecclesiastical power, while demonstrating that papal authority ultimately depended on temporal support. However, the arrival of Norman forces under Robert Guiscard, who sacked Rome while ostensibly rescuing Gregory VII, revealed the complex international dimensions of the church-state conflict. The development of new military technologies and tactics during Henry IV's reign reflected the changing nature of medieval warfare. The construction of stone castles throughout the empire, many built by ministeriales using imperial resources, created defensive networks that could withstand prolonged sieges while serving as bases for offensive operations. the increasing use of crossbows and other mechanical weapons began to challenge the dominance of heavy cavalry, while the emergence of urban militias provided alternative sources of military manpower that could balance noble power. Henry V's rebellion against his father in 1104 to 1106 demonstrated how the investiture controversy had fundamentally altered the dynamics of imperial succession. The young king's alliance with papal forces and rebellious German nobles created a coalition that proved impossible for the aging Henry IV to overcome. The emperor's final years, spent in exile and stripped of most imperial prerogatives, illustrated the personal costs of the prolonged conflict, while highlighting the institutional damage inflicted on imperial authority. The Concordat of Worms, negotiated between Henry V and Pope Calixtus II in 1122, represented a carefully crafted compromise that preserved essential interests of both parties while establishing new frameworks for church-state relations. The agreement distinguished between the spiritual and temporal aspects of episcopal office, allowing the Pope to invest bishops with ring and staff, while preserving the emperor's right to invest them with secular authority through sceptre and land grants. This distinction, though sometimes difficult to maintain in practice, provided theoretical foundations for coexistence between imperial and papal authority. The Concordat's provisions varied significantly between Germany and Italy, reflecting the different political conditions in each region. In Germany, where imperial authority remained strong, bishops would receive secular investiture before spiritual consecration, ensuring their loyalty to the emperor. In Italy and Burgundy, where papal influence was greater, spiritual investiture would precede temporal grants, acknowledging the Pope's primary authority over ecclesiastical appointments. These regional variations demonstrated the pragmatic flexibility that made the Concordat politically viable while establishing precedents for future negotiations between secular and ecclesiastical authorities. The death of Henry V in 1125 without male heirs precipitated a succession crisis that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Holy Roman Empire. The German princes, assembled at Mainz, faced a choice between continuing the Salian dynasty through Henry's nephew, Frederick of Swabia, or selecting an alternative candidate who might restore stability after decades of investiture conflicts. Their decision to elect Lothar of Supplinburg, Duke of Saxony, reflected a deliberate rejection of hereditary succession in favour of electoral principles that would define imperial politics for centuries. Lothar III's reign from 1125 to 1137 established crucial precedents for imperial governance, while temporarily strengthening royal authority through careful political manoeuvring. His marriage alliance with the Welfs, sealed by his daughter Gertrude's union with Henry the Proud of Bavaria, created a powerful coalition that dominated German politics, while simultaneously sowing seeds of future conflict. The emperor's Italian campaigns, though militarily successful, revealed the persistent challenges of maintaining imperial authority south of the Alps without permanent military occupation. The election of Conrad III in 1138 marked the beginning of Hohenstaufen rule, a dynasty that would preside over the empire's most glorious and tumultuous period. Conrad's selection by the German princes over Henry the Proud represented a deliberate choice of Swabian leadership over Saxon Welf dominance, creating factional divisions that would plague imperial politics throughout the 12th century. The new emperor's Hohenstaufen origins, derived from the family's ancestral castle in Swabia, established a new geographical centre of imperial power, while maintaining traditional claims to Carolingian legitimacy. Conrad III's reign witnessed the emergence of the great factional conflict between Welfs and Waiblings that would define German politics for generations. The emperor's confiscation of Henry the Proud's duchies of Saxony and Bavaria in 1138 created a powerful opposition movement led by Henry's son Henry the Lion, who inherited both his father's territorial ambitions and his resentment against Hohenstaufen authority. The resulting civil wars, though ultimately unsuccessful in overthrowing Conrad, demonstrated the limitations of imperial authority when faced with determined noble resistance backed by substantial territorial resources. The Second Crusade provided Conrad III with an opportunity to demonstrate imperial leadership on the international stage while temporarily diverting attention from domestic conflicts. The emperor's decision to take the cross in 1147, influenced by Bernard of Clairvaux's passionate preaching, reflected both genuine religious conviction and calculated political advantage. The massive German army that assembled for the crusade, estimated over 20,000 knights and infantry, represented the largest military force the empire had fielded since Charlemagne's campaigns, demonstrating the substantial resources available to effective imperial leadership. The crusading expedition's catastrophic failure in Anatolia revealed the practical limitations of medieval military logistics and the dangers of operating far from established supply lines. Conrad's army, decimated by Turkish attacks and Byzantine treachery, suffered losses that eliminated much of the German military elite, while undermining the emperor's reputation for military competence. The survivors who reached the Holy Land found themselves reduced to a fraction of their original strength, capable of little more than token participation in the siege of Damascus before retreating to Europe in defeat. Frederick Barbarossa's accession to the imperial throne in 1152 marked the beginning of the Hohenstaufen Golden Age, a period characterized by unprecedented territorial expansion, administrative innovation, and cultural achievement. The new emperor's election at Frankfurt demonstrated the German prince's confidence in his ability to restore imperial prestige while managing the complex factional divisions that had plagued his predecessor's reign. Frederick's physical appearance, described by contemporary chroniclers as tall and powerfully built with a distinctive red beard that earned him his nickname, projected an image of martial prowess that would prove crucial to his political success. The emperor's first Italian campaign in 1154 to 1155 established the pattern of military intervention that would define his relationship with the peninsula for the next 3 decades. Frederick's march south of the Alps with a substantial German army demonstrated his determination to restore imperial authority over the wealthy Lombard cities that had grown increasingly independent during the investiture conflicts. The campaign's initial success, culminating in his imperial coronation by Pope Adrian IV in Rome, masked underlying tensions that would soon erupt into open warfare. The Lombard cities' resistance to imperial authority reflected fundamental changes in medieval urban society that challenged traditional feudal relationships. Milan, the largest and most prosperous city in northern Italy, had developed communal institutions that governed trade, taxation, and military affairs independently of imperial oversight. The city's massive walls, reinforced with advanced defensive technologies, enclosed a population exceeding 100,000 inhabitants, whose commercial activities generated wealth that rivaled royal treasuries. The Milanese commune's ability to field armies of citizen soldiers, equipped with crossbows and supported by professional engineers, demonstrated how urban prosperity could translate into military power capable of challenging imperial authority. Frederick's second Italian campaign in 1158 revealed his sophisticated understanding of the legal and administrative foundations necessary for effective imperial governance. The Diet of Roncaglia, convened in November 1158, assembled legal scholars from the University of Bologna to define imperial prerogatives throughout the Italian territories. The resulting Constitutio Habita established the emperor's authority to collect taxes, appoint officials, and exercise judicial supremacy over all imperial territories, creating legal frameworks that justified extensive intervention in local affairs. The Siege of Milan in 1158 to 1162 demonstrated both the potential and limitations of imperial military power when confronted with determined urban resistance. Frederick's army, reinforced by contingents from allied Italian cities and German nobles, completely encircled Milan's formidable fortifications while constructing elaborate siege works designed to starve the defenders into submission. The emperor's use of advanced siege engines, including massive trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing several hundred pounds, represented the cutting edge of medieval military technology. The siege's duration, lasting nearly 4 years with intermittent truces, revealed the enormous resources required to overcome well-fortified urban centres defended by motivated populations. Milan's eventual surrender in March 1162 provided Frederick with his greatest triumph, while simultaneously creating conditions for future rebellion. The emperor's decision to raise the city's walls and scatter its population throughout the surrounding countryside demonstrated his determination to eliminate centres of resistance to imperial authority. The destruction of Milan's cathedral and civic buildings, witnessed by representatives from throughout northern Italy, served as a powerful warning to other cities contemplating resistance, while generating deep resentment that would fuel future opposition movements. The establishment of imperial administration throughout Lombardy required sophisticated bureaucratic innovations that transformed the nature of medieval governance. Frederick's appointment of German officials to key positions in conquered cities introduced administrative practices developed in the empire's northern territories while adapting them to Italian conditions. The creation of the office of Podesta, an imperial official responsible for governing individual cities, represented a crucial innovation that balanced local autonomy with imperial oversight. These appointed governors, typically drawn from the German ministeriales class, possessed both the administrative competence and personal loyalty necessary for effective imperial governance. The emperor's Landfrieden initiatives represented perhaps his most significant contribution to medieval governance, establishing legal frameworks that would influence European political development for centuries. The Landfrieden of 1152, proclaimed immediately after Frederick's coronation, prohibited private warfare throughout the empire, while establishing imperial courts with jurisdiction over disputes between nobles. The legislation's enforcement required extensive military resources and administrative supervision, but its success in reducing endemic violence demonstrated the practical benefits of centralized authority. The Lombard League's formation in 1167 marked the beginning of organized resistance to imperial authority that would challenge Frederick's Italian ambitions for the remainder of his reign. The alliance, initially comprising 16 cities including Milan, Cremona and Bergamo, represented unprecedented cooperation between traditionally competitive urban communities. The League's military organization, based on contingents provided by member cities and coordinated through elected commanders, created flexible defensive capabilities that could respond rapidly to imperial threats while maintaining local autonomy. The Battle of Legnano on May 29, 1176, represented the decisive confrontation between imperial and communal forces that would determine the future of northern Italy. Frederick's army, composed primarily of German heavy cavalry supported by Italian allies, encountered the Lombard League's forces on the plain northwest of Milan. The battle's outcome hinged on the effectiveness of the League's infantry formations, equipped with long pikes and crossbows, against the traditional charge of imperial knights. The emperor's personal participation in the battle, during which he was reportedly unhorsed and briefly believed dead, demonstrated both his military courage and the high stakes involved in the conflict. The imperial defeat at Legnano forced Frederick to fundamentally reconsider his Italian strategy. while acknowledging the practical limitations of military solutions to political problems. The emperor's subsequent negotiations with the Lombard League, culminating in the Peace of Constance in 1183, represented a sophisticated compromise that preserved essential imperial prerogatives while granting substantial autonomy to the Italian cities. The agreement's provisions, carefully crafted to balance competing interests, established precedents for federal governance that would influence European political development throughout the medieval period. The Peace of Constance granted the Lombard cities the right to elect their own officials, maintain their own fortifications, and exercise judicial authority over their territories in exchange for recognition of imperial sovereignty and payment of modest tribute. This arrangement, though representing a significant retreat from Frederick's earlier ambitions, actually strengthened imperial authority by creating stable relationships based on mutual benefit rather than military coercion. The city's prosperity, no longer threatened by constant warfare, generated increased tax revenues that supported imperial activities throughout the empire. Frederick's administrative innovations extended far beyond his Italian territories, transforming the governance of the empire's German heartland through systematic legal and bureaucratic reforms. The establishment of imperial cities throughout Swabia and Franconia created centres of royal authority that could balance the power of traditional noble families while generating revenues through commercial activities. These urban foundations, typically located at strategic river crossings or mountain passes, developed into thriving commercial centres that enhanced imperial resources while providing military bases for royal campaigns. The emperor's cultivation of ministerialis families throughout the empire created a loyal administrative class that provided continuity during periods of imperial absence. These unfree knights, bound to imperial service through personal oaths and dependent on royal favour for their status, developed sophisticated administrative skills that enabled them to govern complex territories independently. The castle complexes they constructed, featuring distinctive architectural elements that proclaimed their imperial connections, became centres of local administration while serving as symbols of royal authority throughout the empire. Frederick's marriage to Beatrice of Burgundy in 1156 brought substantial territorial additions to the empire while demonstrating his sophisticated understanding of dynastic politics. The union provided the emperor with legitimate claims to extensive territories in the Rhône Valley, including the wealthy commercial cities of Lyon and Arles. The integration of these Burgundian territories required careful attention to local customs and legal traditions as Frederick's administrators worked to harmonise diverse regional practices within broader imperial frameworks. The emperor's patronage of literary and artistic production during his reign contributed to a cultural renaissance that enhanced imperial prestige throughout Europe. The court poets who celebrated Frederick's achievements, including the anonymous author of the Archpoet's verses, created literary works that combined classical learning with contemporary political themes. The architectural projects sponsored by imperial patronage, particularly the reconstruction of imperial palaces at Gelnhausen and Wimpfen, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of symbolic representation while providing practical centres for royal administration. Frederick's death during the Third Crusade in 1190 created a succession crisis that would test the institutional foundations he had established throughout his long reign. The emperor's drowning in the Salef River while leading his army toward the Holy Land deprived the crusading movement of its most experienced military leader, while leaving the empire in the hands of his son Henry VI, whose political skills had yet to be tested by the challenges of independent rule. Henry VI's accession to the imperial throne marked the beginning of the most ambitious phase of Hohenstaufen expansion, as the new emperor pursued territorial acquisitions that would have transformed the political geography of medieval Europe. His marriage to Constance of Sicily, negotiated during Frederick Barbarossa's reign, provided claims to the wealthy Norman kingdom that controlled southern Italy and Sicily. The union of these territories under imperial authority would create a vast realm stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout Europe. The conquest of Sicily required extensive military campaigns that demonstrated Henry VI's considerable strategic abilities while revealing the challenges of governing diverse populations with conflicting loyalties. The Norman kingdom's sophisticated administrative system, inherited from earlier Arab and Byzantine rulers, provided models for efficient governance that Henry adapted to imperial needs. The integration of Sicilian resources, including the kingdom's substantial naval forces and commercial revenues, significantly enhanced imperial capabilities while creating new opportunities for territorial expansion. Henry VI's sudden death in 1197 at the age of 32 precipitated the most serious succession crisis in imperial history, as competing claimants and their supporters plunged the empire into civil war. The emperor's infant son, Frederick, born in 1194, possessed legitimate hereditary claims to both the imperial throne and the Sicilian kingdom, but his minority created opportunities for rival candidates to assert their own ambitions. The resulting conflict would reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe while ultimately producing the most remarkable ruler of the medieval period. The emergence of Frederick II as a significant political figure occurred gradually as the young king of Sicily demonstrated exceptional intellectual abilities and political acumen that distinguished him from his contemporaries. His education in the cosmopolitan environment of Palermo, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars collaborated in translating and preserving classical texts, provided him with intellectual foundations that would influence his later achievements. The Sicilian court's sophisticated administrative practices, combining Norman efficiency with Arab learning and Byzantine ceremonial, created an environment that fostered innovation in governance and cultural expression. Frederick's assumption of imperial authority in 1220 marked the beginning of a reign that would earn him the title Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world, while generating conflicts that would ultimately destroy the Hohenstaufen dynasty. The emperor's coronation in Rome, conducted by Pope Honorius III after extensive negotiations, temporarily resolved the disputes that had plagued church-state relations since his father's death. However, Frederick's subsequent actions would demonstrate that his conception of imperial authority extended far beyond traditional medieval frameworks, encompassing innovations in governance, law, and cultural expression that challenged established institutions throughout Europe. The constitutions of Melfi, promulgated in 1231, represented Frederick II's most significant contribution to medieval jurisprudence and administrative practice. These comprehensive legal codes, developed through collaboration between Christian and Muslim scholars, established unified legal frameworks for the Sicilian kingdom while incorporating advanced concepts of royal authority derived from Roman law. The Constitution's provisions for centralized administration, professional bureaucracy, and systematic taxation created governmental structures that surpassed contemporary European practices in their sophistication and efficiency. Frederick's conflicts with the papacy reached unprecedented intensity during the reign of Pope Gregory IX, whose determination to assert papal supremacy over temporal rulers directly challenged the emperor's conception of imperial authority. The Pope's excommunication of Frederick in 1227, ostensibly for delaying his departure on crusade, actually reflected deeper disagreements about the relationship between secular and ecclesiastical power. The emperor's subsequent crusade to the Holy Land, conducted while under papal ban, demonstrated his ability to achieve diplomatic success through negotiation rather than military conquest. The Treaty of Jaffa, negotiated between Frederick II and Sultan al-Kamil in 1229, represented one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of the medieval period. The agreement, reached through extensive correspondence and personal meetings between the emperor and sultan, restored Christian control over Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, without the massive bloodshed that had characterized previous crusades. Frederick's ability to communicate effectively with Muslim rulers, facilitated by his knowledge of Arabic and understanding of Islamic culture, demonstrated the practical benefits of intellectual tolerance and diplomatic flexibility. The emperor's self-coronation as King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre created a powerful symbolic statement about imperial authority while generating controversy throughout Christian Europe. Frederick's decision to crown himself, necessitated by his excommunicated status and the absence of ecclesiastical officials willing to perform the ceremony, demonstrated his rejection of papal claims to supremacy over temporal rulers. The ceremony's conduct, witnessed by representatives from throughout the Crusader states, established precedents for imperial independence from ecclesiastical authority that would influence European political development for centuries. Frederick's return to Italy in 1229 coincided with renewed papal efforts to undermine imperial authority through support for rebellious nobles and cities throughout the emperor's territories. The Pope's alliance with the Lombard League, reformed specifically to resist imperial authority, created military challenges that required extensive resources and sophisticated strategic planning. The emperor's response, combining military campaigns with diplomatic negotiations and administrative reforms, demonstrated his ability to maintain imperial authority despite facing coordinated opposition from multiple enemies. The Siege of Faenza in 1240 to 1241 illustrated Frederick's innovative approach to siege warfare, while revealing the enormous costs associated with maintaining imperial authority over rebellious territories. The emperor's use of advanced siege engines, including counterweight trebuchets and early gunpowder weapons, represented the cutting edge of medieval military technology. The siege's duration, lasting over a year despite the city's relatively modest fortifications, demonstrated the challenges of overcoming determined resistance even with superior resources and technology. Frederick's administrative innovations in Sicily created governmental structures that served as models for later European developments in centralized monarchy. The emperor's establishment of a professional civil service, recruited through competitive examinations and promoted based on merit rather than noble birth, represented a revolutionary departure from traditional feudal practices. The creation of specialized administrative departments, each responsible for specific aspects of governance such as taxation, justice, and military affairs, provided efficient coordination of governmental activities while ensuring accountability through systematic record-keeping. The University of Naples, founded by Frederick II in 1224, represented the emperor's commitment to educational innovation while serving practical needs for trained administrators throughout his territories. The institution's curriculum, combining traditional liberal arts with practical subjects such as law and medicine, produced graduates capable of staffing the sophisticated bureaucracy required for effective imperial governance. The university's location in the imperial capital provided students with opportunities to observe governmental operations while ensuring that the institution remained responsive to imperial needs. Frederick's patronage of scientific and cultural activities during his reign contributed to intellectual developments that would influence European thought for centuries. The emperor's personal interests in mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy led him to sponsor translations of classical texts while supporting original research by scholars from throughout the known world. His correspondence with learned men from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities demonstrated intellectual curiosity, that transcended religious boundaries while advancing human knowledge in multiple disciplines. The emperor's treatise De Arte Venandi cum Avibus exemplified his approach to empirical observation and systematic analysis of natural phenomena. The work's detailed descriptions of bird behavior, based on extensive personal observation and experimentation, challenged traditional authorities while establishing new standards for scientific accuracy. The manuscript's elaborate illustrations, depicting various species of birds and hunting techniques, demonstrated the emperor's commitment to combining artistic expression with scientific documentation. Frederick's conflicts with Pope Innocent IV, who succeeded Gregory IX in 1243, reached levels of intensity that threatened the fundamental structure of medieval European society. The Pope's deposition of the emperor at the Council of Lyon in 1245, declaring him a heretic and releasing his subjects from their oaths of allegiance, represented the most extreme assertion of papal authority over temporal rulers in medieval history. The emperor's response, rejecting papal claims while maintaining his imperial dignity, created a constitutional crisis that would influence church-state relations throughout the medieval period. The Siege of Parma in 1247 to 1248 demonstrated both the extent of Frederick's military resources and the limitations of imperial authority when confronted with determined opposition supported by external allies. The emperor's construction of an elaborate siege city, complete with permanent buildings and defensive fortifications, revealed his determination to overcome resistance through sustained military pressure. The siege's ultimate failure, resulting from a coordinated attack by the defenders and their papal allies, represented a significant setback to imperial prestige while demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated opposition to imperial authority. Frederick II's death in 1250 marked the beginning of the end for Hohenstaufen power, as his successors proved unable to maintain the complex political and military arrangements that had sustained imperial authority throughout his reign. The emperor's son, Conrad IV, who inherited both the imperial title and the Sicilian kingdom, faced immediate challenges from papal forces and rebellious nobles who sought to exploit the transition period to advance their own interests. The young king's death in 1254, possibly from poison administered by papal agents, eliminated the last effective Hohenstaufen ruler while precipitating the Great Interregnum that would paralyze imperial authority for nearly 2 decades. The collapse of centralized imperial authority following Conrad IV's death created a power vacuum that would fundamentally alter the political structure of medieval Europe. The German princes, freed from effective royal oversight, began asserting greater independence while competing foreign candidates claimed the imperial title without possessing the resources necessary for effective governance. The resulting fragmentation of authority would persist until the election of Rudolf of Habsburg in 1273, by which time the Holy Roman Empire had been permanently transformed from a centralized monarchy into a loose confederation of semi-autonomous territories. The death of Conrad IV in 1254 plunged the Holy Roman Empire into its most severe constitutional crisis since the investiture conflicts of the 11th century. The young king's demise in Naples, amid whispers of poisoning by papal agents, left behind a 2-year-old son, Conradin, whose minority and precarious position in Sicily rendered him incapable of asserting meaningful authority over the vast imperial territories. The German princes, who'd grown accustomed to substantial autonomy during the later Hohenstaufen period, now faced the prospect of either accepting a child king under papal guardianship or selecting an alternative candidate who could provide effective leadership during increasingly turbulent times. The Electoral College's deliberations revealed the fundamental tensions that had been building within the empire's political structure for decades. The 7 prince-electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne and Trier, the King of Bohemia, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the Count Palatine of the Rhine possessed vastly different interests and territorial concerns that made consensus difficult to achieve. The ecclesiastical electors, still influenced by papal opposition to Hohenstaufen rule, favoured candidates who would restore harmonious relations with Rome, while the secular princes prioritised the preservation of their recently acquired autonomy and the selection of a ruler who would not threaten their territorial gains. The election of Richard of Cornwall in 1257 represented a compromise solution that satisfied neither the empire's need for effective leadership nor the electors' desire for a malleable ruler. Richard, brother of Henry III of England and one of the wealthiest men in Europe due to his Cornish tin mines, possessed the financial resources necessary to purchase electoral support, while lacking the territorial base within the empire that might threaten princely independence. His coronation at Aachen in May 1257, attended by only a fraction of the German nobility, demonstrated the limited enthusiasm his candidacy generated among the empire's political elite. The simultaneous election of Alfonso X of Castile by a rival faction of electors created an unprecedented situation in imperial history, as two legitimate claimants possessed equal legal standing to the imperial throne. Alfonso's candidacy, supported by the archbishops of Cologne and Trier along with several secular princes, reflected the international dimensions of imperial politics and the growing influence of foreign powers in German affairs. The Castilian king's extensive territorial holdings in Iberia, combined with his scholarly reputation and claims to Hohenstaufen inheritance through his mother, provided substantial credentials for imperial rule despite his physical absence from German territories. Richard of Cornwall's actual governance of the empire proved sporadic and ineffective, as his primary residence in England and his limited understanding of German political conditions prevented him from establishing meaningful authority over the fractious princes. His 4 visits to Germany between 1257 and 1272 accomplished little beyond ceremonial functions and the collection of taxes from imperial cities, while the real business of governance devolved to local authorities who recognised no superior jurisdiction. The king's reliance on English advisers and his inability to communicate effectively in German further alienated potential supporters while reinforcing perceptions of his foreignness. Alfonso X's approach to imperial rule proved even more detached from German realities, as the Castilian king never set foot in the empire during his entire reign. His governance consisted primarily of diplomatic correspondence and the dispatch of representatives who lacked both the authority and resources necessary to implement royal policies. The Castilian court's preoccupation with the Reconquista and Alfonso's scholarly pursuits, including his monumental legal code, the Siete Partidas, and his astronomical tables, left little time or attention for the complex demands of imperial administration. The practical consequences of this dual monarchy became apparent as local conflicts erupted throughout the empire without effective royal intervention. The Rhineland cities formed defensive leagues to protect their commercial interests against predatory nobles, while territorial princes expanded their domains through conquest and marriage alliances that ignored traditional feudal obligations. The absence of imperial justice encouraged private warfare on a scale not seen since the early 11th century, as disputes that would previously have been resolved through royal courts now required military resolution. The period's most significant territorial changes occurred in the eastern regions, where the Duchy of Austria had escheated to the empire following the death of Frederick II, Duke of Austria, in 1246. The duchy's strategic location controlling the Danube trade routes and its substantial revenues made it one of the most coveted prizes in the empire, attracting claimants from throughout Central Europe. Ottokar II of Bohemia emerged as the most successful competitor, using his kingdom's military resources and diplomatic connections to establish effective control over Austria, Styria, and eventually Carinthia and Carniola. Ottokar's expansion created a Bohemian power bloc that stretched from the Sudetes to the Adriatic, fundamentally altering the balance of power within the empire. The Bohemian king's administrative efficiency, demonstrated through his systematic colonization of frontier territories and his establishment of new towns throughout his domains, provided a stark contrast to the chaos prevailing in Western Germany. His court at Prague became a centre of learning and artistic production that rivaled the greatest European capitals, while his military innovations, including the extensive use of crossbowmen and siege engines, established Bohemian forces as among the most formidable in Europe. The interregnum's impact on imperial cities proved particularly significant, as these communities found themselves forced to develop autonomous defensive and administrative capabilities in the absence of royal protection. The Rhenish League, formed in 1254 and eventually encompassing over 70 cities, created unprecedented mechanisms for interurban cooperation that included common coinage, standardized weights and measures, and coordinated military responses to external threats. The League's success in maintaining trade routes and suppressing brigandage demonstrated the practical benefits of collective action, while establishing precedents for urban autonomy that would influence German political development for centuries. The ecclesiastical territories experienced similar pressures toward independence, as bishops and abbots found themselves compelled to act as temporal rulers without imperial oversight. The Archbishop of Cologne's territorial acquisitions in Westphalia, achieved through a combination of purchase, conquest, and strategic marriage alliances, created a substantial ecclesiastical principality that controlled crucial trade routes between the Rhine and the North Sea. Similar developments occurred throughout the empire, as ecclesiastical leaders adapted to the realities of temporal governance while maintaining their spiritual responsibilities. The death of Richard of Cornwall in 1272 eliminated one claimant to the imperial throne, while intensifying competition among potential successors. Alfonso Quec's continued absence from Germany and his preoccupation with Castilian affairs had already undermined his credibility among the German princes, who increasingly viewed his candidacy as a diplomatic fiction rather than a practical solution to the empire's governance crisis. The electors' recognition that effective imperial rule required a candidate with substantial territorial holdings within the empire and the military capacity to enforce royal authority led them to consider alternatives who possessed these essential qualifications. The election of Rudolf of Habsburg in 1273 represented a carefully calculated compromise that balanced the electors' desire for effective leadership with their determination to preserve their recently acquired autonomy. Rudolf's selection over more prominent candidates such as Ottokar II of Bohemia reflected the electors' preference for a ruler whose power base, while substantial, remained limited enough to avoid threatening their independence. The new king's territorial holdings in southwestern Germany centered on the family's ancestral lands in Alsace and the Aargau, provided sufficient resources for effective governance while remaining geographically confined to regions that posed no direct threat to the major electoral territories. Rudolf's coronation at Aachen in October 1273 marked the formal end of the Great Interregnum, though the new king faced enormous challenges in restoring imperial authority after nearly 2 decades of fragmentation. The ceremony itself, attended by representatives from throughout the empire, demonstrated the widespread desire for renewed royal leadership, while highlighting the institutional damage inflicted by the prolonged vacancy. The king's immediate priorities included the recovery of alienated royal territories, the restoration of imperial justice, and the resolution of territorial disputes that had festered during the interregnum. The new king's most pressing challenge involved the confrontation with Ottokar II of Bohemia, whose extensive territorial acquisitions during the interregnum had created a power block that threatened to overshadow royal authority. Ottokar's refusal to perform homage for his Austrian territories, based on his claim that these lands had been acquired through legitimate conquest rather than imperial grant, created a constitutional crisis that required immediate resolution. The Bohemian king's military resources, including substantial cavalry forces and advanced siege equipment, made him a formidable opponent whose defeat would require careful planning and substantial military commitment. Rudolf's systematic approach to the Bohemian crisis demonstrated the political and military skills that would characterize his entire reign. His diplomatic efforts to isolate Ottokar through alliances with Hungary and Poland created strategic pressures that complemented his military preparations, while his careful attention to legal justifications for his actions maintained support among the German princes. The king's ability to present himself as the defender of imperial rights against foreign aggression resonated with nobles who had grown concerned about Bohemian expansion during the interregnum. The Siege of Vienna in 1276 represented the decisive confrontation between Habsburg and Bohemian forces that would determine the future of southeastern Europe. Rudolf's army, assembled through careful negotiation with princes throughout the empire, demonstrated the restored effectiveness of royal leadership while revealing the substantial military resources available to determined imperial authority. The siege's conduct, featuring extensive use of siege engines and coordinated attacks on multiple sections of the city's fortifications, showcased the advanced military techniques that had developed during the interregnum period. Ottokar's death at the Battle of Dürnkrutt in 1278 eliminated the primary threat to Habsburg authority, while providing Rudolf with the opportunity to reshape the political geography of Central Europe. The battle itself, fought on the Marchfeld east of Vienna, witnessed the destruction of Bohemian military power through a combination of superior tactics and strategic positioning. Rudolf's decision to personally lead the decisive cavalry charge, despite his advanced age of 60, demonstrated the martial prowess that had earned him electoral support while inspiring his followers to extraordinary efforts. The aftermath of Dürnkrutt enabled Rudolf to implement territorial arrangements that would establish Habsburg power for centuries. His grant of Austria and Styria to his sons Albert and Rudolf in 1282 created a substantial territorial base that provided the family with resources independent of electoral politics. The Privilegium Minus, which Rudolf confirmed for the Austrian territories, granted the Habsburgs extensive autonomy within their domains while maintaining formal recognition of imperial sovereignty. These arrangements established precedents for territorial consolidation that would influence German political development throughout the medieval period. Rudolf's administrative reforms throughout the empire demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the institutional changes necessary to restore effective royal authority. His systematic recovery of alienated crown lands, achieved through a combination of legal proceedings and military pressure, restored substantial revenues to the royal treasury while demonstrating the practical benefits of renewed imperial governance. The king's establishment of new administrative procedures, including regular judicial circuits and standardized legal codes, provided frameworks for consistent governance that had been absent during the interregnum. The restoration of imperial authority in Italy proved more challenging than Rudolf's German successors, as the peninsula's political fragmentation had intensified during the interregnum period. The Lombard cities had consolidated their independence through the formation of new leagues and alliances, while the Papal States had expanded their territorial control through systematic acquisition of former imperial territories. Rudolf's recognition of these realities, demonstrated through his renunciation of traditional imperial claims in central Italy, reflected pragmatic acceptance of the limitations of royal power, while preserving essential Habsburg interests in northern regions. The emergence of new commercial and financial networks during the interregnum had created economic conditions that both supported and constrained royal authority. The Italian banking houses, particularly the Medici and Fugger families, had developed sophisticated credit mechanisms that enabled territorial princes to finance military campaigns and administrative expansion without royal assistance. These financial innovations provided alternatives to traditional feudal obligations, while creating new forms of political dependence that rulers could exploit for their own purposes. Rudolf's death in 1291 created succession challenges that tested the institutional foundations he'd established during his 18-year reign. The German prince's rejection of his son Albert in favour of Adolf of Nassau reflected their continued determination to prevent the emergence of hereditary monarchy while maintaining the electoral system's flexibility. Adolf's election demonstrated the electors' preference for candidates whose limited territorial resources would preserve their own autonomy, even at the cost of effective imperial governance. The brief reign of Adolf of Nassau from 1292 to 1298 illustrated the continuing tensions between electoral politics and effective governance that had characterized the post-interregnum period. Adolf's attempts to strengthen royal authority through territorial acquisitions and administrative reforms generated opposition from princes who had supported his election precisely because they expected him to remain weak. His military campaigns in Thuringia and his efforts to recover alienated crown lands created conflicts that ultimately led to his deposition by the same electors who had originally chosen him. Albert II's election in 1298 marked the return of Habsburg power to the imperial throne, though his reign would be dominated by conflicts with both domestic opponents and foreign enemies. The new king's victory over Adolf at the Battle of Golheim demonstrated Habsburg military capabilities while establishing Albert's reputation as a formidable warrior king. His subsequent coronation at Aachen restored traditional ceremonial practices while emphasizing continuity with his father's policies and territorial arrangements. The assassination of Albert I in 1308 by his nephew John of Swabia created another succession crisis that would bring the Luxembourg dynasty to imperial prominence. The murder, motivated by disputes over territorial inheritance and personal grievances, shocked contemporary observers while demonstrating the persistent violence that characterized medieval political competition. Albert's death eliminated the most experienced royal candidate while creating opportunities for alternative dynasties to assert their claims to imperial authority. The election of Henry VII of Luxembourg in 1308 represented a significant shift in imperial politics, as the new king brought different priorities and territorial interests to the throne. Henry's background as Count of Luxembourg had provided him with extensive experience in the complex diplomatic and military challenges of governing border territories, while his family's traditional connections to France created new possibilities for imperial foreign policy. The Luxembourg dynasty's relatively modest territorial base within the empire ensured that Henry's election would not threaten the electoral prince's autonomy, while providing sufficient resources for effective governance. Henry VII's Italian expedition of 1310 to 1313 represented the most ambitious attempt to restore imperial authority in the peninsula since Frederick II's campaigns of the previous century. The emperor's decision to revive traditional claims to Lombard sovereignty reflected both personal ambition and genuine belief in the universal character of imperial authority. His army's march across the Alps, supported by Ghibelline allies throughout northern Italy, initially achieved remarkable success in re-establishing imperial control over territories that had been independent for decades. The Siege of Brescia in 1311 demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Henry's Italian strategy, as the emperor's forces encountered determined resistance from urban militias supported by Guelph allies. The city's massive fortifications, constructed during the interregnum period using advanced military engineering techniques, required extensive siege operations that consumed enormous resources while providing time for enemy forces to organize coordinated opposition. The siege's eventual success, achieved through systematic bombardment and coordinated assaults, established Henry's military reputation while revealing the enormous costs associated with Italian campaigns. Henry's imperial coronation in Rome in 1312 marked the temporary triumph of his Italian ambitions while generating new conflicts with papal authority and local political factions. The ceremony, conducted in the Lateran Basilica rather than St. Peter's due to security concerns, demonstrated the precarious nature of imperial authority in the papal city while maintaining essential symbolic elements of imperial legitimacy. The emperor's subsequent efforts to establish permanent administrative control over central Italian territories encountered fierce resistance from both ecclesiastical and secular opponents, who viewed imperial authority as a threat to their independence. The sudden death of Henry VII in 1313 near Siena eliminated the most promising attempts to restore imperial authority in Italy, while creating new succession challenges in Germany. The emperor's demise, possibly from malaria contracted during his Italian campaigns, occurred at the moment when his military and diplomatic efforts appeared likely to achieve lasting success. His death's timing, coinciding with preparations for a decisive campaign against the Kingdom of Naples, prevented the completion of his Italian strategy while leaving his territorial gains vulnerable to enemy counterattacks. The disputed election of 1314 plunged the Holy Roman Empire into a constitutional crisis that would reshape its political landscape for generations. The simultaneous selection of Louis of Bavaria by one electoral faction and Frederick of Austria by another created an unprecedented situation where two legitimate claimants possessed equal legal standing to the imperial throne. The Electoral College's division reflected deeper tensions within the empire's political structure, as the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne and Trier found themselves aligned against the secular electors of Saxony, Brandenburg and the Palatinate, while Bohemia's King John of Luxembourg attempted to mediate between the competing factions. Louis of Bavaria's candidacy drew support from princes who favoured a more decentralised imperial structure that would preserve their recently acquired autonomy. The Bavarian Duke's territorial base in southeastern Germany provided substantial military resources while remaining geographically confined enough to avoid threatening the major electoral territories. His supporters emphasised his military experience against Hungarian raiders and his successful administration of Bavaria's complex territorial divisions, arguing that these qualifications prepared him for the broader challenges of imperial governance. Frederick of Austria's claim rested on his Habsburg inheritance and the precedent established by his father Albert the Stern's successful reign. The Austrian Duke's supporters, led by the ecclesiastical electors, argued that Habsburg territorial consolidation in the southeast provided the empire with necessary stability while maintaining traditional relationships with the papacy. Frederick's extensive landholdings in Austria, Styria and Carinthia generated substantial revenues that could support imperial administration without requiring excessive taxation of the German princes. The resulting civil war demonstrated the sophisticated military capabilities that had developed within the empire during the previous century. Both claimants assembled armies that incorporated advanced siege techniques, coordinated cavalry tactics, and innovative use of crossbow formations that reflected the influence of Italian military developments. The conflict's initial phases witnessed a series of inconclusive engagements as both sides maneuvered for strategic advantage, while attempting to secure additional territorial allies. The Battle of Gamelsdorf in November 1313 provided Louis of Bavaria with his first significant victory, though the engagement's limited scope prevented decisive resolution of the succession dispute. The battle unfolded in the marshy terrain south of Munich, where Frederick's Austrian forces encountered Louis's Bavarian army in a carefully planned ambush. The Austrian cavalry's initial charge became bogged down in the soft ground, allowing Bavarian infantry formations to surround and systematically destroy the enemy force. Frederick's personal capture during the battle's final phase eliminated his immediate military threat while providing Louis with a valuable bargaining chip for future negotiations. Frederick's imprisonment at Trausnitz Castle created opportunities for Louis to consolidate his position throughout the empire, though the Austrian duke's supporters continued to resist Bavarian authority. The Habsburg territories in Austria and Styria remained under the control of Frederick's brother Leopold, who organised systematic resistance to Bavarian occupation forces. The resulting guerrilla warfare in the Alpine regions demonstrated the challenges of maintaining imperial authority over hostile populations, while consuming military resources that Louis needed for broader imperial campaigns. The papal response to the disputed election revealed the continuing tensions between imperial and ecclesiastical authority that had characterized church-state relations since the investiture conflicts. Pope John XXII's refusal to recognize either candidate's legitimacy reflected papal determination to assert ultimate authority over imperial succession while maintaining the Church's traditional role as arbiter of disputed claims. The Pope's subsequent excommunication of Louis of Bavaria in 1324 escalated the conflict beyond mere dynastic rivalry into a fundamental confrontation over the theoretical foundations of imperial authority. Louis's response to papal intervention demonstrated the sophisticated legal and theological arguments that had developed within imperial circles during the previous century. His court theologians, led by Marsilius of Padua and William of Ockham, articulated theories of imperial authority that derived legitimacy from popular consent rather than ecclesiastical approval. These intellectual developments, synthesized in works such as Marsilius's Defensor Pacis, provided theoretical foundations for imperial independence from papal oversight, while influencing broader European discussions of political legitimacy. The Emperor's Italian expedition of 1327 to 1330 represented the most ambitious attempt to restore imperial authority in the peninsula since Henry VII's campaigns 2 decades earlier. Louis's decision to revive traditional claims to Lombard sovereignty reflected both personal ambition and genuine commitment to the universal character of imperial authority. His army's march across the Alps encountered initial success as Ghibelline allies throughout northern Italy rallied to imperial banners, providing local knowledge and military support that proved crucial for the campaign's early achievements. The Siege of Pisa in 1328 demonstrated the advanced military engineering capabilities that Louis had developed during his German campaigns. The city's massive fortifications, constructed using the latest defensive techniques and supported by Genoese naval forces, required extensive siege operations that showcased imperial military innovation. The emperor's use of counterweight trebuchets, capable of hurling stones weighing over 300 pounds, combined with coordinated attacks by specialized engineering units, eventually breached the city's walls after a siege lasting nearly 6 months. Louis's imperial coronation in Rome in January 1328 marked the temporary triumph of his Italian ambitions, while generating unprecedented conflicts with papal authority. The ceremony, conducted by representatives of the Roman clergy in the absence of papal approval, demonstrated the emperor's determination to assert imperial independence from ecclesiastical oversight. The coronation's conduct in St. Peter's Basilica, despite papal prohibitions, emphasized traditional imperial prerogatives while challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The establishment of imperial administration throughout central Italy required sophisticated bureaucratic innovations that adapted German administrative practices to Italian conditions. Louis's appointment of German officials to key positions in conquered territories introduced administrative procedures that emphasized systematic record-keeping and standardized legal codes. The creation of new judicial circuits, staffed by trained lawyers familiar with both Roman and canon law, provided frameworks for consistent governance that had been absent during the prolonged period of papal-imperial conflict. The emperor's support for the spiritual Franciscans and his appointment of Pietro Reinalducci as anti-Pope Nicholas V created a direct challenge to papal authority that resonated throughout European Christendom. The Franciscan controversy centered on debates over apostolic poverty and the proper relationship between the church and material wealth, provided Louis with theological justifications for his opposition to papal temporal claims. The anti-pope's establishment in Rome, though brief, demonstrated imperial capacity to challenge papal authority even within the traditional centre of ecclesiastical power. The economic dimensions of Louis's Italian campaigns reveal the substantial financial resources required for sustained imperial intervention in the peninsula. The emperor's systematic taxation of conquered territories, combined with forced loans from Italian banking houses, generated revenues that supported his military operations while creating resentment among local populations. The development of new financial instruments, including bonds secured by future tax collections, demonstrated the sophisticated fiscal mechanisms that had evolved to support medieval military campaigns. The gradual collapse of imperial authority in Italy during 1329 to 1330 reflected the fundamental challenges of maintaining control over hostile populations without permanent military occupation. The resurgence of Guelph opposition, supported by papal resources and French diplomatic intervention, created coordinated resistance that overwhelmed imperial defensive capabilities. Louis's retreat across the Alps in 1330, pursued by enemy forces and abandoned by former allies, marked the definitive end of imperial ambitions in central Italy, while demonstrating the practical limitations of medieval military power. The emperor's return to Germany coincided with renewed challenges from Habsburg supporters, who had used his Italian absence to reorganize their opposition. Frederick of Austria's release from captivity in 1325, negotiated through papal mediation, had restored Habsburg leadership to the anti-Bavarian coalition while providing experienced military command for renewed resistance efforts. The resulting conflicts in southwestern Germany demonstrated the persistent nature of dynastic rivalries while revealing the institutional weaknesses that prevented effective imperial governance. The Treaty of Hagenau in 1330 represented a sophisticated compromise that temporarily resolved the succession dispute while establishing precedents for shared imperial authority. The agreement's provisions, which recognized both Louis and Frederick as legitimate rulers while dividing administrative responsibilities between them, created unprecedented arrangements for dual monarchy within the empire. Frederick's recognition as King of the Romans, while Louis retained the imperial title, demonstrated the flexibility of medieval political arrangements when faced with intractable constitutional problems. The practical implementation of dual monarchy proved more challenging than the treaty's theoretical provision suggested, as competing administrative systems created confusion and conflict throughout the empire. The division of revenues between the two rulers, based on complex formulas that allocated specific territories and income sources to each claimant, required extensive bureaucratic coordination that often broke down during periods of political tension. The resulting administrative chaos encouraged territorial princes to assert greater independence while reducing the effectiveness of imperial governance. Frederick's death in 1330 eliminated the Habsburg challenge to Louis's authority while creating new opportunities for imperial consolidation. The Austrian duke's demise, possibly from injuries sustained during his Italian campaigns, occurred at the moment when the dual monarchy arrangements were beginning to function effectively. His death's timing prevented the full development of shared imperial governance, while leaving Louis as the undisputed imperial claimant for the first time since his election 16 years earlier. The emperor's efforts to strengthen imperial authority during the 1330s encountered persistent opposition from territorial princes who had grown accustomed to substantial autonomy during the prolonged succession dispute. Louis's attempts to recover alienated crown lands through legal proceedings and military pressure generated resistance from nobles who viewed these efforts as violations of privileges acquired during the interregnum period. The resulting conflicts demonstrated the continuing tensions between imperial authority and princely independence that had characterized German politics since the Hohenstaufen period. The emergence of new urban leagues during Louis's reign reflected the continuing development of autonomous political structures within the empire. The Swabian League, formed in 1331 and eventually encompassing over 50 cities, created unprecedented mechanisms for interurban cooperation that included common defence arrangements, standardised commercial practices, and coordinated diplomatic policies. The League's success in maintaining trade routes and suppressing brigandage demonstrated the practical benefits of collective action, while establishing precedents for urban autonomy that would influence German political development for centuries. The emperor's patronage of scholarly and artistic activities during his later reign contributed to intellectual developments that would influence European thought throughout the medieval period. The court scholars who served Louis, including the political theorist Marsilius of Padua and the philosopher William of Ockham, produced works that challenged traditional authorities while advancing new concepts of political legitimacy. Their writings, disseminated through the empire's growing network of universities and scriptoria, influenced broader European discussions of the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The development of new military technologies during Louis's reign reflected the continuing evolution of medieval warfare in response to changing tactical requirements. The emperor's systematic use of gunpowder weapons, including early cannons and handheld firearms, represented some of the earliest applications of these technologies in Central European conflicts. The construction of new fortress designs, incorporating bastions and angled walls specifically designed to withstand artillery bombardment, demonstrated the rapid adaptation of defensive architecture to technological innovation. Louis's death in 1347 created succession challenges that would bring the Luxembourg dynasty to imperial prominence while establishing new precedents for electoral politics. The emperor's demise during a hunting expedition in Bavaria eliminated the most experienced royal candidate while creating opportunities for alternative dynasties to assert their claims to imperial authority. The Electoral College's subsequent deliberations would demonstrate the continuing evolution of imperial succession practices while revealing the persistent tensions between dynastic claims and electoral prerogatives. The election of Charles IV of Luxembourg in 1347 marked the beginning of a new phase in imperial history, as the Bohemian king brought different priorities and territorial interests to the throne. Charles's background as heir to the Bohemian crown had provided him with extensive experience in the complex diplomatic and administrative challenges of governing Central European territories, while his education in Paris had exposed him to the latest developments in legal and administrative theory. The Luxembourg dynasty's substantial territorial base in Bohemia and the surrounding regions provided resources sufficient for effective imperial governance, while maintaining the delicate balance between royal authority and princely autonomy that had characterized post-interregnum politics. The new emperor's immediate priorities included the restoration of imperial prestige after decades of conflict and the establishment of stable institutional frameworks that could survive future succession crises. Charles's sophisticated understanding of the legal and administrative foundations necessary for effective imperial governance, demonstrated through his systematic approach to territorial consolidation and bureaucratic reform, would prove crucial for the empire's political development during the later medieval period. His recognition that imperial authority required both military strength and institutional legitimacy led him to pursue comprehensive reforms that would fundamentally reshape the empire's constitutional structure. The promulgation of the Golden Bull in 1356 represented Charles IV's most significant contribution to imperial constitutional development, establishing legal frameworks that would govern electoral politics for centuries. The document's comprehensive provisions, developed through extensive consultation with legal scholars and political advisors, addressed the fundamental questions of imperial succession that had generated conflicts throughout the previous century. The Golden Bull's systematic codification of electoral procedures, territorial arrangements, and administrative practices created institutional stability that would enable the empire to survive future political crises while maintaining its essential character as a confederation of semi-autonomous territories. The Golden Bull's institutional frameworks proved their durability when the Electoral College convened in 1438 to select a successor to Sigismund of Luxembourg. The elector's choice of Albert II of Austria marked not merely another dynastic transition, but the beginning of Habsburg dominance that would endure for centuries. Albert's election represented a calculated decision by the German princes, who recognized that the Austrian duke's substantial territorial holdings in the southeast provided the military resources necessary to confront the growing Ottoman threat, while his family's traditional moderation in imperial affairs offered reassurance against excessive centralization. Albert II's brief reign from 1438 to 1439 established crucial precedents for Habsburg rule despite lasting barely 18 months. The new king's immediate focus on Hungarian affairs, where his marriage to Elizabeth of Luxembourg had provided claims to that kingdom's throne, demonstrated the international dimensions of Habsburg power that would distinguish the dynasty from its predecessors. His coronation as King of Hungary in Székesfehérvár, conducted according to traditional Magyar ceremonies while incorporating elements of German imperial ritual, symbolized the cultural synthesis that would characterize Habsburg governance throughout Central Europe. The king's military preparations against Ottoman forces revealed the sophisticated defensive strategies that had developed in response to Turkish expansion. Albert's systematic fortification of key strongholds along the Hungarian frontier, including the reconstruction of Buda's massive walls and the establishment of new garrison towns throughout the Danube Valley, created defensive networks designed to channel Ottoman attacks into predetermined killing zones. The employment of Italian military engineers, skilled in the latest fortress design techniques, introduced architectural innovations that would influence Central European fortification for decades. Albert's sudden death from dysentery in 1439, contracted during his campaign against the Ottomans, created a succession crisis that tested the institutional foundations he'd barely begun to establish. His posthumous son, Ladislaus, born 4 months after the king's death, inherited claims to Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary that could not be effectively exercised during his minority. The regency arrangements that followed, dividing administrative responsibilities among various noble factions, demonstrated both the flexibility of Habsburg territorial arrangements and the challenges of maintaining dynastic unity during periods of weak central authority. The Electoral College's selection of Frederick III of Austria in 1440 represented a compromise that preserved Habsburg control while acknowledging the practical limitations of minor heirs. Frederick's position as head of the senior Habsburg line provided constitutional legitimacy, while his extensive territorial holdings in Styria and Carinthia offered sufficient resources for imperial governance. The new king's scholarly temperament and preference for negotiation over military confrontation created expectations of peaceful rule that would prove both beneficial and problematic during his remarkably long reign. Frederick III's coronation journey to Rome in 1452 marked the last imperial coronation performed by a pope. Though the ceremony's significance extended far beyond its historical uniqueness, the elaborate procession through northern Italy, featuring thousands of participants including German nobles, Italian allies, and ecclesiastical dignitaries, demonstrated the continuing prestige of imperial authority while revealing the enormous costs associated with traditional ceremonial obligations. The emperor's marriage to Eleanor of Portugal during the Roman visit established dynastic connections that would prove crucial for future Habsburg expansion, while the wedding celebration in the Eternal City emphasized the international character of imperial authority. The development of Habsburg marriage diplomacy during Frederick's reign established patterns that would define the dynasty's expansion strategy for centuries. The emperor's systematic cultivation of matrimonial alliances throughout Europe, guided by the principle that others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry, created a network of dynastic connections that provided alternatives to military conquest. The negotiation of his son Maximilian's betrothal to Mary of Burgundy in 1477 represented the culmination of this strategy, bringing the wealthy Burgundian territories into the Habsburg sphere through peaceful means rather than expensive military campaigns. The Burgundian inheritance transformed Habsburg prospects from a regional German power to European dynasty of the first rank. The territories acquired through Maximilian's marriage included not only the traditional Burgundian lands in eastern France, but also the wealthy commercial centres of Flanders and the Netherlands. The combined revenues from these territories, generated through sophisticated taxation systems and thriving international trade, provided resources that dwarfed traditional imperial income while creating new opportunities for territorial expansion and administrative innovation. Maximilian's accession to sole rule in 1493 coincided with the emergence of new challenges that would test Habsburg capability throughout Europe. The young king's energetic personality and military ambitions contrasted sharply with his father's cautious approach, leading to more aggressive policies that sought to maximize Habsburg advantages while confronting enemies on multiple fronts. His establishment of the Reichsregime in 1500, an imperial governing council designed to provide continuity during royal absences, represented a sophisticated attempt to balance imperial authority with the practical demands of governing scattered territories. The Reichsregiment's institutional structure reflected Maximilian's understanding of the administrative innovations necessary for effective governance of the empire's complex territorial arrangements. The council's composition, including representatives from all major electoral and princely families, provided mechanisms for consultation and consensus building that had been absent during previous reigns. The establishment of permanent meeting locations in Nuremberg and Augsburg created institutional continuity that survived political transitions, while providing forums for resolving disputes between territorial authorities. Maximilian's military reforms transformed the empire's defensive capabilities through systematic modernization of equipment, training and organisational structures. The creation of the Landsknecht infantry formations, trained in Swiss tactical methods and equipped with long pikes and crossbows, provided imperial forces with capabilities that rivaled the most advanced European armies. The development of standardized artillery pieces, manufactured in imperial foundries throughout Austria and Bohemia, created coordinated firepower that could breach the strongest fortifications while providing decisive advantages in open battle. The Emperor's Italian campaigns during the early 16th century demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Habsburg military power when confronted with determined opposition from multiple enemies. The League of Cambrai, formed in 1508 to partition Venetian territories, initially achieved remarkable success as imperial forces captured key strongholds throughout the Veneto region. However, the subsequent reversal of alliances that created the Holy League against French expansion forced Maximilian to confront enemies who possessed superior naval capabilities and extensive financial resources. The Battle of Agnadello in 1509 showcased the effectiveness of imperial military reforms while revealing the challenges of maintaining extended campaigns in hostile territory. Maximilian's army, featuring coordinated infantry formations supported by mobile artillery, achieved decisive victory over Venetian forces through superior tactics and battlefield coordination. The engagement's aftermath, which saw the systematic capture of Venetian strongholds throughout the mainland territories, demonstrated the practical benefits of military modernization while establishing imperial prestige throughout the Italian peninsula. The emperor's administrative innovations extended beyond military affairs to encompass comprehensive reforms of imperial governance structures. The establishment of the Reichskammergericht in 1495, an imperial supreme court with jurisdiction over disputes between territorial authorities, created legal frameworks that provided alternatives to military resolution of conflicts. The court's procedures, based on Roman law principles adapted to German conditions, established precedents for systematic jurisprudence that would influence European legal development for centuries. Maximilian's patronage of humanist scholars and artists during his reign contributed to cultural developments that enhanced imperial prestige while advancing intellectual innovation. The court's support for printing technology, including the production of elaborate illustrated works such as the Theurdank and the Triumphal Arch, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of propaganda techniques while preserving historical records for future generations. The emperor's personal involvement in these projects, including his collaboration with artists such as Albrecht Dürer, revealed the cultural sophistication that characterized Habsburg governance. The emergence of the Ottoman Empire as a major threat to Central Europe during Maximilian's reign required comprehensive strategic planning that coordinated military, diplomatic, and financial resources. The Turkish conquest of Constantinople in 1453 had eliminated the Byzantine Empire, while providing the Ottomans with a strategic base for expansion into the Balkans. The subsequent Ottoman campaigns in Hungary, culminating in the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, demonstrated the formidable military capabilities that European powers would need to confront. The development of Habsburg defensive strategies against Ottoman expansion reflected sophisticated understanding of the geographical and logistical challenges involved in confronting Turkish forces. The establishment of the military frontier, a system of fortified settlements stretching from the Adriatic to the Carpathians, created defensive networks that could delay Ottoman advances while providing time for the assembly of relief forces. The recruitment of Grenzer units, specialized light infantry trained in irregular warfare tactics, provided capabilities specifically designed to counter Turkish military advantages. Charles's inheritance in 1519 of the most extensive territorial holdings in European history created unprecedented opportunities and challenges for Habsburg power. The union of Spanish, Austrian, Burgundian, and imperial territories under a single ruler provided resources that enabled global expansion while creating administrative complexities that strained existing governmental structures. The emperor's domains, spanning from the Americas to Central Europe, required innovative approaches to governance that could accommodate diverse legal traditions, languages, and cultural practices. The election campaign of 1519 revealed the sophisticated financial mechanisms that had developed to support imperial politics during the early 16th century. Charles's victory over Francis I of France required enormous expenditures that were financed through loans from German banking houses, particularly the Fuggers of Augsburg. The resulting debt obligations, secured by revenues from American silver mines and European territorial taxes, created financial relationships that would influence Habsburg policy for decades, while demonstrating the growing importance of credit mechanisms in European politics. Charles V's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 1520 marked the culmination of Habsburg territorial consolidation while establishing new precedents for imperial ceremonial. The elaborate festivities in Aachen, attended by representatives from throughout Europe and the Americas, demonstrated the global character of Habsburg power while maintaining traditional elements of imperial ritual. The ceremony's incorporation of Spanish and Burgundian ceremonial elements alongside German traditions symbolized the cultural synthesis that would characterize Charles's reign. The emperor's confrontation with the Ottoman Empire reached its climax during the Siege of Vienna in 1529, when Suleiman the Magnificent's massive army threatened the heart of Habsburg power. The Turkish force, estimated at over 100,000 men including elite Janissary units and extensive siege artillery, represented the largest military expedition ever launched into Central Europe. The city's defences, hastily reinforced under the direction of Nicholas Graf Salm, featured innovative bastion designs that incorporated the latest developments in military engineering. The siege's conduct revealed the sophisticated military capabilities that both sides had developed during their prolonged confrontation. The Ottoman army's systematic approach to siege warfare, featuring coordinated artillery bombardments and coordinated infantry assaults, demonstrated the advanced tactical methods that had enabled Turkish expansion throughout the Balkans. The defenders' response, utilizing enfilading fire from bastioned positions and coordinated sorties against Turkish siege works, showcased the defensive innovations that European military engineers had developed in response to artillery warfare. The siege's ultimate failure marked the high tide of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe, while establishing Vienna's reputation as the bulwark of Christendom. The Turkish withdrawal in October 1529, prompted by the approach of winter and the failure to achieve decisive breaches in the city's walls, demonstrated the practical limitations of Ottoman military power when confronted with determined resistance and extended supply lines. The victory's psychological impact throughout Europe enhanced Habsburg prestige while providing powerful propaganda for future military campaigns. The development of Habsburg administrative systems during Charles V's reign required innovations that could coordinate governance across multiple continents while maintaining local autonomy. The establishment of separate councils for different territorial groups, including the Council of Castile, the Council of Aragon, and the Council of the Indies, created specialized administrative bodies that could address regional concerns while maintaining imperial coordination. The emperor's personal involvement in these councils' deliberations, despite his constant travels throughout his domains, demonstrated the intensive management required for effective governance of such extensive territories. The religious challenges that emerged during Charles's reign, particularly the Protestant Reformation initiated by Martin Luther, created new dimensions of conflict that threatened the fundamental unity of the empire. The emperor's role as defender of Catholic orthodoxy, established through his coronation oath and reinforced by papal expectations, conflicted with the practical needs of governing territories that included substantial Protestant populations. The resulting tensions would dominate imperial politics for decades, while creating new opportunities for territorial princes to assert greater independence from central authority. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 represented Charles's recognition that religious unity could no longer be maintained through imperial authority alone. The settlement's principle of cuius regio, eius religio granted territorial rulers the right to determine their subjects' religious affiliation, while establishing legal frameworks for coexistence between Catholic and Protestant authorities. This arrangement, though representing a significant retreat from traditional imperial claims to religious authority, provided practical solutions to conflicts that had threatened to destroy the empire's political structure. Charles V's abdication in 1556 marked the end of the most ambitious attempt to create universal monarchy in European history, while establishing new precedents for Habsburg territorial arrangements. The emperor's division of his territories between his son Philip II, who inherited Spain and its global empire, and his brother Ferdinand I, who received the Austrian lands and the imperial title, created separate Habsburg lines that would pursue different strategies while maintaining dynastic cooperation. This partition, though reducing the immediate resources available to each branch, provided more manageable administrative arrangements while preserving Habsburg influence throughout Europe. The partition of Charles V's vast territories in 1556 created two distinct Habsburg lines that would pursue different strategies in confronting the religious upheaval that had been building throughout the empire for nearly 4 decades. Ferdinand's inheritance of the Austrian lands and the imperial title coincided with the Protestant Reformation's maturation from a theological dispute into a comprehensive challenge to the political and social order that had governed Central Europe since the Carolingian period. The new emperor's immediate priorities included managing the religious divisions that threatened to fragment his territories while simultaneously confronting the persistent Ottoman threat that continued to menace the empire's southeastern frontiers. The Protestant Reformation's origins in Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority in 1517 had transformed from an academic theological debate into a mass movement that attracted support from diverse social groups throughout the German territories. Luther's posting of the 95 Theses on the castle church door in Wittenberg, initially intended as an invitation for scholarly disputation about indulgences, had evolved into a fundamental questioning of ecclesiastical authority that resonated with nobles, burghers, and peasants who harboured various grievances against the established order. The rapid dissemination of Luther's ideas through printed pamphlets, facilitated by the empire's extensive network of commercial towns and universities, created unprecedented opportunities for religious and political mobilization. The Diet of Worms in 1521 represented the first major confrontation between imperial authority and Protestant theology, establishing patterns of conflict that would dominate German politics for generations. Charles V's personal attendance at the assembly, despite his pressing concerns in Spain and Italy, demonstrated the emperor's recognition that religious unity remained essential for effective imperial governance. The Diet's formal proceedings, conducted according to traditional procedures while addressing unprecedented theological questions, reveal the institutional challenges posed by religious innovation to establish political arrangements. Luther's appearance before the assembled princes, bishops, and imperial officials created one of the most dramatic moments in German history, as the Augustinian monk confronted the combined authority of church and empire. The reformer's refusal to recant his theological positions despite facing potential execution as a heretic, demonstrated the personal conviction that would inspire Protestant resistance for decades. His declaration that his conscience remained captive to Scripture alone challenged fundamental assumptions about religious authority while providing theological foundations for political resistance to imperial and papal claims. The Edict of Worms, issued by Charles V following Luther's departure from the Diet, declared the reformer an outlaw while prohibiting the circulation of his writings throughout the empire. The edict's comprehensive provisions, extending beyond theological censorship to include political and economic sanctions against Luther's supporters, demonstrated the emperor's determination to suppress religious innovation through systematic enforcement. However, the edict's practical implementation proved impossible without the cooperation of territorial princes, many of whom harboured their own grievances against ecclesiastical authority and imperial centralisation. Frederick III of Saxony's protection of Luther at Wartburg Castle established crucial precedents for princely resistance to imperial religious policy, while demonstrating the practical limitations of central authority. The elector's decision to shelter the outlawed reformer, despite his own personal loyalty to traditional Catholic practices, reflected the complex political calculations that would characterise noble responses to religious innovation. The castle's remote location in the Thuringian forest provided security for Luther's translation work, while symbolising the geographical fragmentation that would enable Protestant survival despite imperial opposition. The rapid spread of Protestant ideas throughout the empire's urban centres revealed the social and economic grievances that religious reform could address. The imperial cities, with their substantial burgher populations and traditions of political autonomy, provided fertile ground for theological innovations that challenged established hierarchies. Cities such as Strasbourg, Nuremberg, and Augsburg became centres of Protestant activity where Reformed theology merged with urban political aspirations to create powerful movements for religious and social change. The formation of the Schmalkaldic League in 1531 marked the transition from individual princely resistance to coordinated Protestant political action. The alliance, initially comprising 8 princes and 11 cities, created unprecedented mechanisms for collective defence against imperial religious policy, while establishing frameworks for Protestant cooperation that transcended traditional territorial boundaries. The League's founding document, negotiated at the Saxon town of Schmalkalden, combined theological statements with military and political commitments that transformed religious reform into organised resistance. The League's military organisation reflected the sophisticated defensive capabilities that Protestant territories had developed in response to imperial threats. The establishment of common defence funds, supported by contributions from member territories, provided resources for maintaining professional military forces that could respond rapidly to Catholic attacks. The recruitment of experienced commanders, including veterans of the Italian wars and Ottoman campaigns, demonstrated Protestant determination to match imperial military capabilities while adapting proven tactical methods to their defensive needs. The development of Protestant theology during the 1530s and 1540s created intellectual foundations that justified resistance to imperial authority while providing alternative models for church-state relations. The theological works produced by reformers such as Philip Melanchthon and Martin Bucer addressed practical questions of governance, taxation, and legal authority that had immediate political implications. The Augsburg Confession, presented to Charles V in 1530, attempted to demonstrate Protestant orthodoxy while maintaining theological positions that fundamentally challenged traditional ecclesiastical authority. The emperor's response to Protestant organisation revealed the strategic challenges posed by religious division to imperial governance. Charles V's simultaneous confrontation with French expansion, Ottoman invasion, and Protestant resistance strained imperial resources while creating opportunities for his enemies to coordinate their opposition. The emperor's frequent absences from German territories, necessitated by his global responsibilities, provided Protestant forces with time to consolidate their positions while developing military capabilities that could challenge imperial authority. The Schmalkaldic Wars of 1546 to 1547 represented the first major military confrontation between imperial and Protestant forces, testing the military innovations that both sides had developed during the preceding decades. Charles V's decision to launch a comprehensive campaign against the League's leadership demonstrated his determination to resolve religious divisions through military means while reasserting imperial authority over rebellious territories. The emperor's army, assembled from Spanish, Italian, and loyal German forces, represented the most formidable military coalition that had operated in Central Europe since the Ottoman invasions. The Battle of Mühlberg in April 1547 showcased the tactical innovations that had transformed European warfare during the early 16th century. The imperial army's coordinated use of infantry, cavalry, and artillery formations, directed by experienced commanders who had served in multiple theatres, achieved decisive victory over Protestant forces through superior battlefield coordination. The engagement unfolded along the Elbe River, where Charles V's forces executed a complex river crossing under fire that demonstrated both tactical skill and personal courage from the emperor himself. The capture of Elector John Frederick of Saxony and Landgrave Philip of Hesse during the Mühlberg campaign eliminated the Protestant League's primary leadership while providing Charles V with valuable hostages for future negotiations. The Elector's imprisonment, lasting nearly 5 years, removed the most capable Protestant military commander while demonstrating imperial determination to punish religious rebellion. The Landgrave's more cooperative attitude during captivity reflected the diverse motivations that had driven Protestant resistance and the possibilities for negotiated settlements. The Augsburg Interim of 1548 represented Charles V's most ambitious attempt to restore religious unity through imperial legislation that balanced Catholic doctrine with Protestant practices. The document's comprehensive provisions, developed through extensive consultation with theologians from both religious traditions, addressed controversial issues such as clerical celibacy, communion in both kinds, and the authority of Scripture. The interim's implementation required careful negotiation with territorial authorities while maintaining the appearance of imperial supremacy over religious matters. The interim's reception throughout the empire revealed the deep divisions that religious reform had created within German society. Catholic territories generally accepted the emperor's religious settlement, while maintaining reservations about specific provisions that appeared to compromise traditional doctrine. Protestant regions responded with varying degrees of compliance, ranging from grudging acceptance to outright resistance that required military enforcement. The resulting patchwork of religious practices demonstrated the practical impossibility of imposing uniform religious observance through imperial authority alone. The emergence of Maurice of Saxony as a key figure in imperial politics during the late 1540s illustrated the complex loyalties that religious division had created within the empire's noble hierarchy. Maurice's initial support for imperial religious policy, motivated by his rivalry with his Protestant cousin John Frederick, provided Charles V with crucial assistance during the Schmalkaldic Wars. However, the Duke's subsequent alliance with Protestant forces and French enemies demonstrated the fluid nature of political alignments when religious, dynastic, and territorial considerations conflicted. The Treaty of Chambord in 1552, negotiating between Maurice of Saxony and Henry II of France, created an unprecedented alliance between German Protestant forces and foreign enemies of the empire. The agreement's provisions, which granted French forces access to imperial territories in exchange for military support against Charles V, demonstrated the international dimensions that religious conflict had acquired. The treaty's implementation required careful coordination between Protestant and French forces while maintaining the appearance of German patriotism despite foreign alliance. The Siege of Metz in 1552–1553 revealed the limitations of imperial military power when confronted with determined resistance supported by foreign allies. Charles V's massive army, assembled from throughout his European territories, encountered sophisticated defensive preparations that incorporated the latest developments in military engineering. The city's bastioned fortifications, reinforced by French engineers and defended by experienced troops, withstood months of systematic bombardment while inflicting heavy casualties on imperial forces. The emperor's retreat from Metz in January 1553 marked a decisive turning point in the religious wars, demonstrating that military solutions could not resolve the fundamental divisions that had emerged within the empire. The campaign's failure, costing thousands of lives and enormous financial resources, convinced Charles V that negotiated settlement offered the only viable path toward religious peace. The emperor's subsequent diplomatic initiatives reflected this strategic reorientation while acknowledging the practical limits of imperial authority over religious matters. The Peace of Augsburg, negotiated during the Imperial Diet of 1555, established the legal and political frameworks that would govern religious relations within the empire for the next century. The settlement's central principle, encapsulated in the Latin phrase cuius regio, eius religio, granted territorial rulers the authority to determine their subjects' religious affiliation while establishing mechanisms for protecting religious minorities. This arrangement represented a fundamental departure from medieval assumptions about religious unity, while providing practical solutions to conflicts that had threatened to destroy the empire's political structure. The Augsburg settlement's detailed provisions addressed the complex practical questions that religious division had created throughout the empire. The agreement's ecclesiastical reservation, which required Catholic bishops who converted to Protestantism to surrender their temporal territories, protected church land holdings while acknowledging Protestant rights in other contexts. The Declaration Ferdinandea, guaranteeing limited rights for religious minorities in certain territories, demonstrated the negotiators' recognition that complete religious uniformity remained impossible to achieve. The implementation of the Augsburg Peace required extensive administrative coordination that transformed the empire's governmental structures. The establishment of religious parity in imperial institutions, including the Reichskammergericht and various administrative councils, created new mechanisms for managing religious diversity while maintaining imperial unity. The development of detailed procedures for resolving religious disputes provided alternatives to military confrontation, while preserving territorial autonomy in religious matters. The long-term consequences of the Augsburg settlement extended far beyond immediate religious concerns to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of imperial authority and territorial sovereignty. The peace's recognition of princely rights to determine religious policy established precedents for territorial autonomy that would influence German political development for centuries. The settlement's implicit acknowledgement that religious unity could not be maintained through imperial coercion represented a significant retreat from traditional imperial claims while providing foundations for more flexible approaches to governance. The period following the Augsburg Peace witnessed the gradual institutionalization of religious division within the empire's political structures. The development of separate Protestant and Catholic political networks organised around religious affiliation rather than traditional territorial or dynastic loyalties, created new patterns of alliance and conflict that would dominate German politics throughout the later 16th century. The emergence of confessional identity as a primary factor in political calculation transformed the empire's constitutional arrangements while creating new sources of stability and instability. The Catholic League's formation in 1609 represented the culmination of counter-Reformation efforts to organise systematic resistance to Protestant expansion. The alliance, led by Maximilian I of Bavaria and supported by Spanish resources, created military capabilities that could challenge Protestant territorial gains while advancing Catholic political objectives. The League's sophisticated organisational structure, combining religious motivation with professional military planning, demonstrated the evolution of confessional politics from theological disputation to systematic political action. The Protestant Union's establishment in 1608 provided Protestant territories with coordinated defensive capabilities that could counter Catholic military preparations. The alliance's membership, including major territories such as the Palatinate and Württemberg, along with numerous imperial cities, created substantial military resources that could be deployed rapidly in response to Catholic threats. The Union's diplomatic connections with foreign Protestant powers, particularly France and England, provided additional resources while creating international dimensions to German religious conflict. The Jülich-Cleves succession crisis of 1609 to 1614 demonstrated how religious divisions could transform local dynastic disputes into international confrontations that threatened European stability. The competing claims of Catholic and Protestant candidates to these strategically important territories created opportunities for the major confessional alliances to test their military preparations while pursuing broader political objectives. The crisis's resolution through French diplomatic intervention revealed the continuing importance of foreign powers in German religious politics, while establishing precedents for international mediation of internal imperial disputes. The defenestration of Prague in 1618 precipitated the most destructive conflict in German history, as religious tensions that had been building for decades finally erupted into comprehensive warfare. The Bohemian nobles' rejection of Ferdinand II's authority, motivated by fears of Catholic persecution and constitutional violations, created a rebellion that quickly spread throughout the empire. The dramatic incident at Hradčany Castle, where Protestant nobles threw imperial officials from a window, provided powerful symbolism for Protestant resistance, while demonstrating the breakdown of traditional political relationships. The 30 Years' War that followed transformed the empire into a battlefield where religious, dynastic, and international conflicts merged into unprecedented destruction. The war's initial phases witnessed the systematic mobilization of confessional alliances that had been developing since the Augsburg Peace, as Catholic and Protestant forces assembled armies that dwarfed previous military efforts. The conflict's expansion to include foreign powers such as Sweden, France, and Spain created international dimensions that extended far beyond German religious divisions, while subjecting the empire's territories to devastation that would require generations to repair. The defenestration of Prague on May 23, 1618, marked the violent culmination of religious and constitutional tensions that had been building throughout the Habsburg territories since Ferdinand II's accession to the Bohemian throne. The incident itself unfolded in the council chamber of Hradčany Castle, where Protestant Bohemian nobles confronted imperial governors Jaroslav Borita of Martinic and Willem Slavata of Chlum over Ferdinand's systematic violation of religious privileges guaranteed by the Letter of Majesty. The dramatic moment when Count Jindřich Matthias Thurn led the assembled nobles in physically hurling the two Catholic officials and their secretary Philip Fabricius from the castle's third-story window, created powerful symbolism that would resonate throughout European Protestant communities, while providing immediate justification for armed resistance to Habsburg authority. The defenestration's immediate aftermath revealed the sophisticated political organisation that Bohemian Protestant nobles had developed during the preceding decades of religious tension. The rebels' systematic seizure of royal castles throughout Bohemia, coordinated through networks established during previous constitutional crises, demonstrated their capacity for organised military action beyond mere symbolic protest. The formation of a provisional government under the leadership of Count Jindřich Matthias Thurn and the subsequent expulsion of Jesuit clergy from Bohemian territories indicated the rebellion's comprehensive character, extending beyond religious grievances to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between royal authority and noble privileges. Ferdinand II's response to the Bohemian Rebellion reflected both his personal commitment to Catholic orthodoxy and his sophisticated understanding of the strategic challenges posed by Protestant resistance. The emperor's immediate appeal to his cousin Philip III of Spain and his brother-in-law Maximilian of Bavaria demonstrated the international dimensions that German religious conflicts had acquired since the formation of the Catholic League. The systematic mobilization of Catholic resources, including Spanish silver from the Americas and Bavarian military expertise, created coalition warfare capabilities that dwarfed the resources available to individual Protestant territories while establishing precedents for foreign intervention in German affairs. The Bohemian rebels' search for international support revealed the complex diplomatic networks that had developed around European religious divisions. Their initial overtures to the Protestant Union generated limited enthusiasm, as German Protestant princes remained reluctant to support what appeared to be treasonous rebellion against legitimate imperial authority. The rebels' subsequent negotiations with Transylvanian Prince Gabriel Bethlen and their eventual election of Frederick V of the Palatinate as King of Bohemia demonstrated their determination to transform local constitutional disputes into broader European conflicts that could attract substantial foreign assistance. Frederick's acceptance of the Bohemian crown in 1619 transformed a regional rebellion into the opening phase of European warfare that would devastate Central Europe for 3 decades. The Palatine Elector's decision, influenced by his wife Elizabeth Stuart's connections to English Protestant networks and his own Calvinist convictions, represented a calculated gamble that Protestant international support would compensate for the military disadvantages facing Bohemian forces. His coronation in Prague's St. Vitus Cathedral, conducted according to traditional Bohemian ceremonies while emphasizing Protestant theological principles, created powerful symbolism that inspired Protestant resistance throughout the empire, while providing Catholic forces with propaganda opportunities about foreign interference in German affairs. The formation of the Catholic League army under the command of Johann Cercles, Count of Tilly, represented the culmination of counter-Reformation military organisation that had been developing since the late 16th century. Tilly's forces, assembled from Bavarian, Austrian and Spanish contingents, incorporated tactical innovations derived from decades of warfare in the Netherlands and Italy, while maintaining the disciplined religious motivation that characterised Catholic military culture. The army's systematic approach to siege warfare, demonstrated through the methodical reduction of Protestant strongholds throughout Austria and Bohemia, revealed the professional military capabilities that Catholic territories had developed during the preceding decades of religious tension. The Battle of White Mountain on November 8, 1620, marked the decisive confrontation between Catholic and Protestant forces that would determine the fate of Central European Protestantism for generations. The engagement unfolded on the plateau west of Prague, where Frederick's hastily assembled army of Bohemian, German and Hungarian forces encountered Tilly's disciplined Catholic coalition. The battle's outcome, determined within 2 hours of initial contact, demonstrated the superior training and coordination that Catholic forces had achieved through systematic military preparation. The Protestant army's rapid collapse, beginning with the flight of Bohemian cavalry and culminating in the complete rout of remaining forces, eliminated organised Protestant resistance in Bohemia while providing Catholic forces with momentum for broader territorial conquests. Frederick's flight from Prague following the White Mountain defeat earned him the derisive nickname Winter King, while creating a refugee crisis that would influence Protestant politics for decades. The Elector's abandonment of his Bohemian supporters, who faced systematic persecution under Ferdinand II's Restoration government, demonstrated the limitations of international Protestant solidarity when confronted with determined Catholic military action. The subsequent confiscation of Protestant noble properties throughout Bohemia, redistributed to Catholic loyalists and foreign supporters, transformed the kingdom's social structure while providing resources for continued Catholic military campaigns. The systematic recatholicization of Bohemia under Ferdinand II's direction represented the most comprehensive religious transformation attempted in early modern Europe. The emperor's expulsion of Protestant clergy, closure of Protestant schools, and mandatory conversion requirements for noble families created precedents for religious coercion that would influence Catholic policy throughout the Habsburg territories. The Jesuit-directed educational reforms emphasizing Catholic doctrine and Habsburg loyalty sought to eliminate Protestant cultural influences while creating new generations of Catholic subjects who would support imperial authority. The expansion of Catholic military operations into the Palatinate during 1621 to 1622 demonstrated the international dimensions that the German religious conflict had acquired. Spanish forces advancing from the Netherlands coordinated with Bavarian armies moving from the east to systematically reduce Protestant strongholds throughout the Rhineland. The siege of Heidelberg, Frederick's capital, required extensive siege operations that showcased the advanced military engineering capabilities Catholic forces had developed. The city's eventual capture in September 1622 provided Catholic forces with substantial territorial gains while eliminating the primary Protestant stronghold in southwestern Germany. The transfer of the Palatine electoral dignity to Maximilian I of Bavaria in 1623 represented Ferdinand II's most significant constitutional innovation, fundamentally altering the empire's political balance. The emperor's decision to reward his most important ally through this unprecedented elevation demonstrated Habsburg determination to consolidate Catholic political control while punishing Protestant rebellion. The constitutional implications of creating a new electoral position, breaking the traditional balance established by the Golden Bull, would influence imperial politics for decades, while providing Protestant forces with additional grievances against Habsburg authority. The emergence of Christian IV of Denmark as a major Protestant military leader marked the beginning of the war's second phase, as Scandinavian intervention provided Protestant forces with resources and leadership that had been absent since Frederick V's defeat. The Danish king's dual motivation, combining genuine Protestant religious commitment with strategic concerns about Catholic expansion toward the Baltic, created a formidable coalition that could challenge Catholic military dominance. Christian's substantial military resources, including experienced troops from the ongoing Polish wars and revenues from the Sound tolls, provided Protestant forces with capabilities that had been lacking during the Bohemian phase. The Catholic response to Danish intervention revealed the sophisticated strategic planning that had developed within the Catholic League's military organisation. the decision to grant Albrecht von Wallenstein extensive authority to raise and command an independent imperial army represented a fundamental innovation in early modern military organisation. Wallenstein's systematic approach to military recruitment, financing and logistics created unprecedented capabilities that could support large-scale military operations throughout Central Europe, while maintaining the political flexibility necessary for complex coalition warfare. Wallenstein's military innovations transformed the character of early modern warfare through systematic application of entrepreneurial principles to military organisation. His establishment of a comprehensive supply system based on territorial contributions rather than traditional feudal obligations provided imperial forces with logistical capabilities that could sustain extended campaigns in hostile territory. The creation of military manufactories producing standardized weapons and equipment enabled rapid expansion of imperial forces while maintaining quality control that ensured battlefield effectiveness. The Battle of Lutter and Barenberger in August 1626 demonstrated the tactical superiority that Catholic forces had achieved through systematic military reform and professional leadership. Tilly's army, reinforced by Wallenstein's imperial forces, encountered Christian IV's Danish army in the hills south of the Weser River. The engagement's outcome, determined through coordinated cavalry charges that shattered Danish formations, eliminated Danish military power in northern Germany, while providing Catholic forces with momentum for territorial expansion toward the Baltic. Christian IV's personal participation in the battle, during which he sustained serious wounds while attempting to rally his retreating forces, demonstrated the personal courage that characterized Protestant leadership, while revealing the military disadvantages facing anti-Habsburg coalitions. The systematic Catholic conquest of northern German territories during 1627 to 1628 represented the high tide of Habsburg power within the empire. The capture of major Protestant strongholds such as Göttingen, Greifswald and Stralsund provided Catholic forces with control over crucial Baltic trade routes, while eliminating Protestant territorial bases that could support future resistance. The establishment of imperial garrisons throughout these conquered territories, supported by systematic taxation of local populations, created administrative structures that could maintain Catholic control while generating revenues for continued military operations. The Edict of Restitution, promulgated by Ferdinand II in March 1629, represented the most ambitious attempt to reverse the territorial gains that Protestant forces had achieved since the Augsburg Peace. The edict's comprehensive provisions, requiring the return of all ecclesiastical territories secularized since 1552, threatened to eliminate Protestant control over substantial territories throughout northern and central Germany. The systematic implementation of restitution requirements, enforced through imperial military power, created new sources of conflict while demonstrating Catholic determination to achieve complete religious restoration. The edict's practical implementation revealed the enormous administrative challenges involved in reversing 7 decades of territorial and religious change. The appointment of restitution commissioners, supported by imperial military forces, created new bureaucratic structures that could systematically identify and reclaim alienated church properties. The resistance encountered from Protestant territories, ranging from legal challenges to armed opposition, demonstrated the deep roots that Protestant control had established throughout the empire, while revealing the limitations of imperial authority when confronted with determined local resistance. The emergence of Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden as a major Protestant military leader marked the beginning of the war's third phase, as Scandinavian intervention provided Protestant forces with unprecedented military capabilities. The Swedish King's Landing at Peenemünde in July 1630 with an army of 13,000 experienced veterans, represented the most significant foreign intervention in German affairs since the Carolingian period. Gustavus Adolphus's military innovations, including the systematic use of mobile artillery and coordinated infantry cavalry tactics, provided Protestant forces with battlefield capabilities that could challenge Catholic military dominance, while inspiring renewed resistance throughout Protestant territories. The Swedish military system represented the culmination of early modern military reform, incorporating tactical innovations developed during decades of warfare in Eastern Europe. The army's organisational structure, based on standardised regimental formations with integrated artillery support, provided flexibility and firepower that surpassed contemporary European military capabilities. The systematic training programs that produced disciplined infantry formations capable of complex battlefield maneuvers enabled Swedish forces to achieve tactical superiority despite facing numerically superior Catholic armies. The Battle of Breitenfeld on September 17, 1631, marked the decisive confrontation between Swedish and Catholic forces that would transform the war's strategic balance. The engagement unfolded on the plain north of Leipzig, where Gustavus Adolphus's army of 23,000 Swedes and Saxon allies encountered Tilly's Catholic force of 35,000 veterans. The battle's outcome, determined through Swedish tactical innovations that neutralized Catholic numerical advantages, demonstrated the effectiveness of military reform while eliminating the aura of Catholic invincibility that had dominated European warfare for over a decade. The Swedish victory's immediate consequences extended far beyond tactical success to encompass fundamental changes in European military and political relationships. The systematic destruction of Tilly's veteran army, achieved through coordinated artillery bombardment and disciplined infantry advances, eliminated the military foundation of Catholic power in northern Germany, while providing Protestant forces with unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion. The capture of substantial military supplies and artillery pieces enhanced Swedish capabilities while demonstrating the material benefits of battlefield success. Gustavus Adolphus's subsequent march through central Germany represented the most successful Protestant military campaign since the war's beginning. The systematic capture of major Catholic strongholds, including Würzburg, Mainz and Frankfurt, provided Swedish forces with control over crucial commercial and strategic centres, while generating revenues that could support continued military operations. The king's diplomatic negotiations with German Protestant princes, offering protection in exchange for military cooperation, created coalition structures that could sustain Swedish intervention while providing local legitimacy for foreign military presence. The death of Gustavus Adolphus at the Battle of Lutzen on November 16, 1632, eliminated Protestant Europe's most capable military leader while creating new strategic challenges for anti-Habsburg coalitions. The engagement itself, fought in the fog-shrouded fields south of Leipzig, witnessed the Swedish king's personal leadership of a cavalry charge that achieved tactical victory while costing his life. The battle's outcome, a Swedish victory achieved at enormous cost, demonstrated both the effectiveness of Swedish military methods and the personal risks that characterized early modern battlefield leadership. The Swedish army's continuation under the leadership of Axel Oxenstierna and professional commanders such as Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar demonstrated the institutional foundations that Gustavus Adolphus had established. The systematic maintenance of military discipline and tactical effectiveness, despite the loss of charismatic leadership, revealed the professional character that Swedish military reform had achieved. The army's subsequent campaigns throughout southern Germany, including the successful siege of Regensburg and the systematic devastation of Bavaria, maintained Swedish military pressure while generating resources for continued operations. The emergence of France as a major participant in German warfare marked the beginning of the conflict's fourth and final phase, as Cardinal Richelieu's systematic intervention transformed religious war into comprehensive European conflict. The French decision to provide direct military support to Swedish and German Protestant forces, while maintaining diplomatic relations with Catholic powers, demonstrated the sophisticated strategic planning that had characterized French foreign policy since the early 17th century. The deployment of French armies in the Rhineland and northern Italy created multiple theatres of operation that strained Habsburg resources while providing Protestant forces with crucial military assistance. The French military intervention revealed the international dimensions that the German religious conflict had acquired by the 1630s. The coordination of French, Swedish, and German Protestant forces created unprecedented coalition warfare capabilities that could challenge Habsburg power throughout Central Europe. The systematic French financial support for Protestant military operations, including substantial subsidies for Swedish forces and German mercenary companies, provided resources that enabled sustained military campaigns while demonstrating the economic foundations of early modern warfare. The Battle of Nordlingen on September 6, 1634, marked the last major Catholic victory of the war, as Spanish and Imperial forces achieved decisive success against Swedish and German Protestant armies. The engagement unfolded in the hills north of the Danube, where Cardinal Infante Ferdinand's Spanish army coordinated with Imperial forces under Matthias Gallas to surround and systematically destroy enemy formations. The battle's outcome, achieved through superior tactical coordination and the effective use of Spanish infantry formations, eliminated Swedish military power in southern Germany while providing Catholic forces with renewed momentum for territorial recovery. The Swedish defeat's consequences extended throughout Protestant Europe, as the destruction of experienced military formations eliminated capabilities that had required years to develop. The systematic capture of Swedish artillery and military supplies provided Catholic forces with enhanced capabilities while demonstrating the material costs of battlefield defeat. The death of prominent Protestant commanders, including Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar's brother, eliminated experienced leadership that could not be easily replaced while reducing Protestant military effectiveness. The Peace of Prague in 1635 represented Ferdinand II's most significant attempt to achieve negotiated settlement of the German religious conflict while maintaining essential Habsburg interests. The agreement's comprehensive provisions, developed through extensive consultation with German Protestant princes, offered substantial concessions on religious issues while preserving imperial authority over constitutional questions. The treaty's modification of the Edict of Restitution, establishing a new normative date of 1627 for ecclesiastical properties, demonstrated Habsburg willingness to compromise on religious issues while maintaining political control. The Prague settlement's reception throughout the empire revealed the complex motivations that had sustained the religious conflict for nearly 2 decades. Many German Protestant princes accepted the emperor's terms, recognizing that continued warfare threatened their territorial integrity, while offering limited prospects for additional gains. However, the systematic French and Swedish rejection of the settlement, combined with continued military operations throughout German territories, demonstrated the international dimensions that prevented purely German solutions to the conflict. The war's final phase, lasting from 1635 to 1648, witnessed the transformation of religious conflict into comprehensive European warfare that encompassed diplomatic, military, and economic dimensions. The systematic French military intervention in the Rhineland, coordinated with Swedish operations in northern Germany, created multiple theatres of operation that strained Habsburg resources while preventing Catholic consolidation of territorial gains. The emergence of professional military commanders such as Turenne and Condé provided French forces with tactical capabilities that could challenge Habsburg military dominance while inspiring renewed resistance throughout Protestant territories. The devastating demographic and economic consequences of prolonged warfare became apparent throughout German territories as military operations continued without decisive resolution. The systematic destruction of agricultural resources, necessitated by military supply requirements, created famine conditions that affected civilian populations regardless of religious affiliation. The collapse of commercial networks, disrupted by military operations and territorial fragmentation, eliminated economic foundations that had supported Central European prosperity for centuries. The emergence of military entrepreneurship during the war's later phases created new forms of organised violence that operated independently of political control. The systematic recruitment of mercenary companies, financed through territorial contributions and plunder, created military forces that possessed substantial autonomy while maintaining nominal allegiance to various political authorities. The development of military logistics systems, capable of supporting large armies through systematic exploitation of occupied territories, enabled sustained military operations while imposing enormous costs on civilian populations. The gradual exhaustion of military resources throughout Europe created conditions that favoured negotiated settlement over continued warfare. The systematic depletion of manpower through decades of military operations eliminated the demographic foundations necessary for sustained conflict, while reducing the effectiveness of remaining military forces. The financial exhaustion of major powers, demonstrated through currency debasements and fiscal crises, created economic pressures that favoured diplomatic resolution over continued military expenditure. The Peace of Westphalia, negotiated simultaneously at Münster and Osnabrück during 1646 to 1648, represented the most comprehensive attempt to resolve the complex political, religious, and territorial issues that had generated 3 decades of warfare. The diplomatic proceedings, involving representatives from throughout Europe, addressed fundamental questions about sovereignty, religious authority, and territorial arrangements that extended far beyond German concerns. The systematic coordination of multiple bilateral and multilateral negotiations created unprecedented diplomatic complexity while providing frameworks for comprehensive settlement. The Westphalian settlement's religious provisions established new legal frameworks that would govern church-state relations throughout Central Europe for centuries. The treaty's confirmation of the Augsburg Peace's essential principles, while extending recognition to Calvinism alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism, demonstrated the negotiators' recognition that religious diversity had become a permanent feature of German political life. The establishment of 1624 as the new normative date for ecclesiastical properties provided compromise solutions that balance Catholic and Protestant territorial interests while creating legal certainty for future disputes. The settlement's constitutional provisions fundamentally restructured the Holy Roman Empire's political organization while preserving its formal existence. The systematic recognition of territorial sovereignty, including the right of German princes to conclude alliances with foreign powers, transformed the empire from a hierarchical monarchy into a loose confederation of autonomous states. The establishment of new mechanisms for imperial governance, including religious parity in imperial institutions and enhanced roles for the imperial diet, created frameworks for managing diversity while maintaining nominal unity. The territorial arrangements negotiated at Westphalia reflected the complex balance of power that had emerged from 3 decades of warfare. the systematic redistribution of territories, including Swedish acquisitions in Pomerania and French gains in Alsace, demonstrated the international dimensions that German political arrangements had acquired. The recognition of Swiss and Dutch independence, formalised through the treaty's comprehensive provisions, acknowledged political realities that had developed over centuries while providing legal frameworks for future international relations. The Peace of Westphalia fundamentally transformed the Holy Roman Empire from a functioning medieval monarchy into a loose confederation of virtually sovereign states, each jealously guarding its territorial prerogatives while maintaining only nominal allegiance to the imperial crown. The settlement's recognition of territorial sovereignty had effectively neutered imperial authority, reducing the emperor to little more than a ceremonial figurehead whose actual power rarely extended beyond his hereditary Austrian domains. This constitutional revolution created a political landscape where over 300 individual territories, ranging from substantial kingdoms like Prussia and Bavaria to tiny free cities and ecclesiastical principalities, operated as independent entities while participating in the increasingly hollow rituals of imperial governance. The Imperial Diet, relocated permanently to Regensburg in 1663, epitomised this new political reality. What had once been an assembly capable of decisive action became a perpetual diplomatic conference, where representatives debated endlessly over procedural matters while avoiding substantive decisions that might threaten their master's autonomy. The Diet's division into 3 colleges, electors, princes and cities, created institutional gridlock that prevented effective governance while providing endless opportunities for foreign powers to manipulate German politics through strategic alliances and subsidies. The elaborate ceremonial protocols that governed the Diet's proceedings, including complex rules about seating arrangements and precedents, consumed more attention than actual legislative business. The emergence of Prussia as a major European power during the late 17th and early 18th centuries created the most significant challenge to Austrian hegemony within the empire since the medieval conflicts between Pope and Emperor. The Hohenzollern dynasty's systematic territorial consolidation, beginning with the acquisition of East Prussia in 1618 and culminating in the royal coronation of Frederick I in 1701, created a northern German power bloc that could rival Habsburg influence while maintaining nominal subordination to imperial authority. The Prussian military system, developed through decades of warfare against Swedish and Polish forces, produced professional armies that surpassed contemporary European standards in discipline, training and battlefield effectiveness. Frederick William II's military reforms during the early 18th century transformed Prussia from a collection of scattered territories into a unified military state capable of challenging established European powers. The king's systematic expansion of the army from 38,000 to 83,000 troops, supported by comprehensive administrative reforms that maximised tax collection and military recruitment, created unprecedented military capabilities that dwarfed the resources available to other German princes. The establishment of the canton system, which divided the kingdom into military districts responsible for recruiting and maintaining specific regiments, provided reliable manpower while creating deep connections between military service and civilian society. The Prussian military's distinctive characteristics reflected the kingdom's unique geographical and political circumstances. The army's emphasis on precise drill, rapid deployment, and coordinated battlefield maneuvers compensated for numerical disadvantages while maximising the effectiveness of limited resources. The development of standardised equipment, uniforms, and tactical procedures created military efficiency that enabled Prussian forces to achieve tactical superiority despite facing larger enemy armies. The systematic training of officers through military academies and practical experience produced professional leadership that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining unit cohesion under extreme pressure. The War of Austrian Succession marked the beginning of the great German dualism that would dominate Central European politics for the next century. Frederick II's invasion of Silesia in December 1740, launched immediately after Maria Theresa's accession to the Habsburg throne, demonstrated Prussian willingness to challenge Austrian authority through direct military action. The young king's systematic preparation for the campaign, including detailed intelligence gathering and diplomatic negotiations with potential allies, revealed the sophisticated strategic planning that characterized Prussian military culture. The rapid conquest of Silesia's major fortresses, achieved through coordinated siege operations and mobile warfare tactics, provided Prussia with substantial territorial gains while demonstrating the effectiveness of military modernization. The Battle of Mollwitz on April 10, 1741, established Frederick II's reputation as a military commander, while revealing both the strengths and limitations of Prussian military reforms. The engagement unfolded on the snow-covered fields near Brieg, where Frederick's army of 22,000 troops encountered Austrian forces under Field Marshal Wilhelm Reinhard von Neipperg. The battle's initial phases witnessed the collapse of Prussian cavalry formations under Austrian attack, forcing Frederick to flee the battlefield while believing his army faced destruction. However, the disciplined performance of Prussian infantry, maintaining formation despite cavalry losses and systematically advancing against Austrian positions, ultimately achieved victory through superior training and battlefield coordination. The Silesian Wars demonstrated the transformation of European warfare from dynastic conflicts to struggles for territorial and commercial advantage. The systematic Prussian exploitation of Silesia's mineral resources, including extensive coal deposits and textile manufacturing capabilities, provided economic foundations that could support continued military expansion while reducing dependence on foreign subsidies. The province's strategic location, controlling crucial trade routes between northern and southern Europe, enhanced Prussian political influence while creating new opportunities for diplomatic maneuvering. Maria Theresa's response to Prussian aggression revealed the resilience of Habsburg power despite the apparent weakness of the Austrian succession. The Empress's systematic mobilization of Hungarian resources, achieved through careful negotiation with Magyar nobles and recognition of traditional constitutional privileges, provided military capabilities that enabled sustained resistance to Prussian expansion. The Hungarian Diet's grant of substantial military assistance, including 100,000 troops and extensive financial support, demonstrated the continuing vitality of Habsburg dynastic loyalty, while providing resources for comprehensive military campaigns. The diplomatic revolution of 1756, which realigned European alliances and created new patterns of international conflict, reflected the changing balance of power within the Holy Roman Empire. The Treaty of Versailles, negotiating between France and Austria, represented a fundamental reversal of traditional Habsburg-Bourbon rivalry, while creating new opportunities for coordinated action against Prussian expansion. The alliance's military implications, including French financial support for Austrian military operations and coordination of strategic planning, provided Habsburg forces with resources that could challenge Prussian military advantages while demonstrating the international dimensions of German political competition. The 7 Years' War transformed the struggle between Austria and Prussia into a global conflict that encompassed European, American, and Asian theatres. Frederick II's preemptive invasion of Saxony in August 1756 demonstrated Prussian determination to maintain strategic initiative while preventing the formation of hostile coalitions. The The systematic occupation of Dresden and Leipzig provided Prussian forces with advanced positions for operations against Austrian and Russian armies, while generating substantial revenues through territorial contributions. The war's expansion to include British support for Prussia and French assistance to Austria created international dimensions that extended far beyond German territorial disputes. The Battle of Rossbach on November 5, 1757, showcased the tactical innovations that had made Prussian forces the most effective military organisation in Europe. The engagement unfolded on the rolling hills southwest of Leipzig, where Frederick's army of 21,000 troops encountered a combined Franco-Austrian force of 64,000 under the Duke of Soubise. The battle's outcome, achieved through Frederick's famous oblique order attack that concentrated overwhelming force against a single point in the enemy line, demonstrated the effectiveness of Prussian tactical doctrine while eliminating the immediate threat to Prussian territory from Western enemies. The systematic Prussian victory at Rossbach, accomplished in less than 2 hours with minimal casualties, established Frederick II's reputation as the greatest military commander of his generation. The engagement's tactical brilliance, featuring coordinated cavalry charges and disciplined infantry advances that shattered enemy formations, provided textbook examples of battlefield leadership that would influence military education for generations. The capture of substantial enemy artillery and military supplies enhanced Prussian capabilities while demonstrating the material benefits of tactical superiority. The Battle of Leuthen, on December 5, 1757, represented the culmination of Frederick II's military genius and the effectiveness of Prussian military reforms. The engagement took place on the plain west of Breslau, where Frederick's army of 33,000 troops confronted Austrian forces numbering 65,000 under Prince Charles of Lorraine. The battle's conduct, featuring Frederick's masterful use of terrain and tactical deception to achieve local superiority despite overall numerical disadvantage, demonstrated the sophisticated battlefield leadership that characterized Prussian military culture. The systematic Austrian defeat, achieved through coordinated attacks that rolled up enemy positions from flank to flank, eliminated Austrian military power in Silesia while securing Prussian control over the province. The war's enormous human and economic costs reveal the limitations of 18th century military capabilities when confronted with sustained coalition warfare. The systematic devastation of German territories, particularly in Saxony and Silesia, eliminated agricultural and commercial resources that had supported Central European prosperity for generations. The demographic impact of prolonged military operations, including massive casualties from battle and disease, reduced population levels throughout the empire, while creating social disruption that would require decades to repair. The Peace of Hubertusburg in 1763 confirmed Prussian retention of Silesia, while establishing the territorial arrangements that would govern German politics for the remainder of the 18th century. The treaty's recognition of Prussian sovereignty over the disputed province demonstrated the practical results of military effectiveness, while acknowledging the permanent alteration of power relationships within the empire. The settlement's broader implications, including the confirmation of Prussian status as a major European power, transformed the Holy Roman Empire's internal dynamics while creating new patterns of alliance and conflict that would influence Central European politics for generations. The French Revolutionary Wars beginning in 1792 subjected the Holy Roman Empire to unprecedented challenges that would ultimately prove fatal to its continued existence. The revolutionary ideology emanating from France, with its emphasis on popular sovereignty and national self-determination, directly challenged the feudal and dynastic principles that had governed German political life for centuries. The systematic French military campaigns along the Rhine, beginning with the declaration of war in April 1792, created immediate threats to imperial territories while demonstrating the military effectiveness of revolutionary armies motivated by ideological commitment rather than traditional dynastic loyalty. The First Coalition War revealed the institutional weaknesses that had developed within the empire's military and political structures during the preceding century of territorial fragmentation. The imperial army's performance during the early campaigns, characterized by poor coordination between contingents from different territories and inadequate supply arrangements, demonstrated the practical consequences of political decentralization. The systematic French victories at Valmy, Jemmapes and Fleurus eliminated imperial forces from the Low Countries while providing revolutionary armies with momentum for territorial expansion into German territories. The systematic French occupation of the Rhineland during 1794 to 1795 eliminated imperial authority over territories that had been integral to the empire since Charlemagne's reign. The revolutionary administration's implementation of French legal codes, administrative procedures, and educational systems created new forms of governance that directly challenged traditional imperial institutions. The abolition of feudal obligations, ecclesiastical privileges, and guild restrictions provided local populations with tangible benefits, while demonstrating the practical advantages of revolutionary political principles. The emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte as first consul in 1799 transformed French policy toward the Holy Roman Empire from revolutionary expansion to systematic territorial reorganization. Napoleon's sophisticated understanding of German political conditions, gained through extensive study of imperial constitutional arrangements and diplomatic correspondence, enabled him to exploit the empire's internal divisions while advancing French strategic objectives. The systematic French cultivation of relationships with middle-sized German states, particularly Bavaria, Württemberg and Baden, created new alliance patterns that bypassed traditional imperial authority while providing France with reliable German allies. The Peace of Luneville in 1801 formalized the territorial changes that French military success had achieved while establishing precedents for comprehensive reorganization of German political arrangements. The treaty's provisions, requiring the cession of all imperial territories west of the Rhine to France, eliminated substantial revenues and strategic positions that had supported imperial authority for centuries. The agreement's compensation clauses, promising equivalent territories east of the Rhine for dispossessed princes, created opportunities for systematic territorial redistribution that would fundamentally alter the empire's political geography. The imperial recess of 1803 represented the most comprehensive territorial reorganization in German history, as the systematic secularization of ecclesiastical territories and mediatization of smaller principalities were eliminated over 100 political entities while consolidating power in the hands of larger states. The process, supervised by French diplomatic pressure and implemented through complex negotiations among German princes, transferred approximately 3.2 million subjects and substantial territorial resources to enlarged kingdoms and duchies. The systematic elimination of imperial cities, ecclesiastical principalities, and minor counties created simplified political arrangements that favoured French interests while reducing the institutional complexity that had characterised imperial governance. The secularization process eliminated the Catholic Church's temporal authority throughout the empire, while transferring enormous wealth to secular rulers. The systematic confiscation of monastic properties, episcopal territories and cathedral chapters provided enlarged states with resources that could support administrative expansion and military modernization. The displacement of thousands of ecclesiastical officials, from prince-bishops to village priests, created social disruption while eliminating traditional sources of imperial support among the higher clergy. The mediatization of smaller territories created new patterns of political allegiance that bypassed traditional imperial institutions. The systematic absorption of free cities, imperial knights, and minor principalities by larger neighbours eliminated the political fragmentation that had characterized the empire since the medieval period. The creation of enlarged kingdoms in Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden provided France with reliable allies while reducing the number of political entities that could participate in anti-French coalitions. The Battle of Austerlitz on December 2, 1805, demonstrated Napoleon's military genius while eliminating the Third Coalition's capacity for coordinated resistance to French expansion. The engagement unfolded on the Pratzen Heights east of Brünn, where Napoleon's army of 73,000 troops confronted the combined Austrian and Russian forces of 85,000 under Emperor Francis II and Tsar Alexander I. The battle's outcome, achieved through Napoleon's tactical masterpiece that lured enemy forces into attacking weakened French positions while concealing the main attack against the Allied centre, eliminated Austrian military power while forcing Russian withdrawal from Central Europe. The systematic French victory at Austerlitz, accomplished through superior tactical coordination and battlefield leadership, provided Napoleon with the strategic position necessary to reshape German political arrangements according to French interests. The battle's immediate consequences, including the Treaty of Pressburg that eliminated Austrian influence in southwestern Germany, created opportunities for comprehensive territorial reorganization that would eliminate the Holy Roman Empire's remaining institutional foundations. The formation of the Confederation of the Rhine on July 12, 1806, represented the culmination of Napoleon's systematic policy of German territorial reorganization, while providing the immediate cause for the Holy Roman Empire's dissolution. The Confederation's membership, initially including 16 German states led by Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, created a French-dominated alliance that controlled substantial Central European territories while maintaining nominal independence from direct French administration. The systematic withdrawal of these territories from imperial jurisdiction eliminated the geographical and political foundations necessary for continued imperial existence. The Confederation's constitutional arrangements reflected Napoleon's sophisticated understanding of German political conditions while serving French strategic interests. The member states' obligations, including military contributions for French campaigns and adherence to French foreign policy, created coordinated capabilities that could support French expansion while maintaining the appearance of German autonomy. The systematic exclusion of Austria and Prussia from the Confederation's membership eliminated the major powers that could challenge French hegemony while providing opportunities for systematic territorial expansion. Emperor Francis II's abdication of the imperial title on August 6, 1806, formally ended the Holy Roman Empire's existence after 1,006 years of continuous history. The Emperor's declaration, issued from Schönbrunn Palace, acknowledged the practical impossibility of maintaining imperial authority over territories that had withdrawn from imperial jurisdiction, while preserving Habsburg dignity through the retention of the Austrian imperial title. The systematic dissolution of imperial institutions, including the imperial diet, the imperial court, and the various administrative councils, eliminated the bureaucratic structures that had governed German political life for centuries. The empire's final dissolution occurred without military resistance or popular protest, demonstrating the extent to which imperial authority had become irrelevant to German political life. the systematic transfer of imperial regalia to Vienna, where they would remain as historical artifacts rather than symbols of active authority, symbolized the transformation of medieval institutions into museum pieces. The quiet acceptance of imperial dissolution by German princes and populations reflected the practical recognition that the empire had ceased to function as an effective political organization decades before its formal abolition. The Holy Roman Empire's end marked the conclusion of one of history's most remarkable political experiments, an institution that had survived for over a millennium through adaptation to changing circumstances while maintaining continuity with its Carolingian origins. The empire's ultimate failure reflected not inherent weaknesses, but the revolutionary challenges of the early 19th century, when nationalism, popular sovereignty, and centralized administration created new forms of political organization that medieval federalism could not accommodate. The empire's legacy would endure in the constitutional traditions, legal systems, and cultural institutions that shaped Central European development for centuries, while its memory would inspire later attempts at German unification and European integration